Good evening, historians. Tonight, we open the quiet pages of history, not to stare at shiny crowns or golden thrones, but to follow the careful footsteps of kings who ruled with patience, paper, and thought. These are not loud stories. You won't hear crowds cheering or swords clashing. Instead, you'll hear the scratch of a pen, the rustle of scrolls, the soft voice of a ruler asking questions no one else thought to ask. These are the kings who ruled with lists instead of lances, who wrote letters instead of leading charges, who built empires not with fire, but with focus. Before we settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of quiet history we explore here. And drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady background hum, and let's gently ease into tonight's journey together. You've heard of kings who conquered with swords, but tonight, let me tell you about the one who conquered with receipts. While others rode into power draped in armor and glory, Henry VII sat in silence, hunched over parchment, counting pennies. No grand speeches, no bloody battles, just a man, a candle, and a terrifying obsession with order. And somehow, that was enough to change a kingdom. You might think the founder of a powerful royal dynasty would have come to power wielding swords or commanding massive armies. But Henry VII, the first Tudor king of England, preferred a different weapon. Paper, ink, wax, and quietly signed scrolls became his chosen instruments. And as you settle in under your covers, imagine a dim, candle-lit room in the Palace of Westminster, where a man once turned the entire kingdom into a series of double-checked expenses. The War of the Roses had just ended. England was exhausted, its nobility fractured, and the crown was poorer than ever. Henry didn't roar into rule. He crept in. Unlike his son, Henry VIII, who sliced through wives and monasteries like butter, Henry VII ruled with frugality, fear, and financial files. A room in the palace was transformed into a miniature treasury, stacked with scrolls, boxes, and endless parchments. Everything from castle repairs to the purchase of ribbon for the Queen's dress had to pass under his eyes. Every coin had a destination. Every penny had to be earned. And he did earn them in the dullest ways imaginable. Henry VII established what was called the chamber system of finance. He centralized the income and expenditures of the monarchy into a tightly controlled mechanism that went directly through his household. If someone bought firewood for a royal kitchen, Henry saw it. If a guard's armor needed polish, it was recorded. For every boring financial detail, there was a receipt, and often his handwriting on it. He rarely smiled, and courtiers described him as cautious, pale, and humorless. But it was this cold detachment that saved England's throne. While previous kings had flung gold at barons, Henry hoarded it in secret coffers beneath his chambers. Some said he kept boxes of silver under his bed. He taxed marriages. He taxed inheritances. He taxed nobles for being alive. But strangely, people obeyed. Because they were tired. Because the kingdom had bled too long. And Henry, in his quiet, ghostly way, offered something new. Order. One curious document from 1497 describes his payment of 6 pence to a man who brought news of a new mole in the Queen's garden. 6 pence for a mole report. Another document shows a payment of 4 pence to a young boy who had spotted a smuggler's barge along the Kent coast. Every action, even whispers and moles, was itemized. He also employed spies, but not the cloak and dagger type. These were accountants. They wandered the counties not to kill, but to count. They watched the movement of goods. They tallied cattle. They ensured no one was skimming off the top of the royal income. The kingdom became a spreadsheet. The royal court itself changed too. Under Henry's predecessor, Edward IV, the court had been lively, filled with knights jousting and lords feasting. Henry's court was quiet, formal, almost clerical. The royal wardrobe clerk often complained of having to reuse fabrics or darn old cloaks because the king disliked spending. He did not invest in art or music. He did not commission great palaces. He did not even favor lengthy speeches. He once ordered a servant to reduce the number of candles lit during dinner. A waste of tallow, he had said. To his advisors, he often whispered decisions. They leaned in. He didn't like to repeat himself. One curious part of Henry VII's daily life was the Privy Seal warrant process. It sounds regal, but was actually a glorified system of sticky notes. These were small memos signed by Henry for everything from cheese shipments to court musicians. A single surviving warrant orders the purchase of 4 pecks of dried peas, for Lent, signed in the king's narrow, scratchy hand. This was Henry's way of ruling, not with sword or sermon, but by checking the books, again and again. Yet not everyone appreciated it. The nobility, especially the powerful northern lords, chafed under the weight of financial scrutiny. They were used to lavish grants and unmonitored spending. Some even accused Henry of extortion through a network of financial enforcers known as the Council Learned in the Law, a court-like body that enforced payment of debts and bonds. And unlike many institutions of the time, it did not operate publicly. Though summoned before, it rarely returned with good news. The power of the crown was being reshaped, not through charisma or violence, but through quiet coercion, through formality, through paperwork. And yet, that system worked. By the end of his reign, the English monarchy was solvent. It had money in the treasury, and the king's authority stretched farther than it had in generations. But this raises a question, one that drifted quietly through the corridors of Westminster, long after Henry's death. Was Henry VII a genius of financial order, or merely a man so terrified of chaos that he buried the kingdom in receipts? Henry VII didn't just stabilize the English monarchy through stern economic planning. He transformed the very idea of what it meant to be a king. The sword became secondary. The throne, once a stage for dramatic declarations and divine right, became more like a finely tuned office desk, positioned for paperwork, quietly guarded, and always slightly ajar for whispers of corruption. By the early 1500s, England looked different, not because of grand cathedrals or monuments, but because of new behaviors. Nobles who had once expected automatic privileges now lived in quiet caution. They filed tax reports. They paid fines. They petitioned the crown with a tone of humility, because Henry had turned the monarchy into something unfamiliar, accountable. He did this with an instrument almost forgotten today, the bond. Bonds were formal agreements, legally binding financial promises, often forced upon nobles and officials. If a man was suspected of treason, conspiracy, or even mismanagement, he would not be immediately imprisoned or executed. Instead, he would be bound, sometimes for hundreds of pounds, a massive sum, to guarantee his future loyalty. If he misbehaved, again, the crown would collect the bond. And if he remained obedient, the bond remained a quiet threat. This was not war. This was paper war. At its peak, Henry's government held thousands of these bonds. Even bishops and royal servants had them. One report in the archives notes over £40,000 in bonds issued to just a handful of nobles in a single year. To a modern eye, it seems small, but for a country recovering from civil war, it was the engine of compliance. Imagine a nobleman in the north, perhaps Lord Percy, sitting at his wooden table in a damp stone manor, reading his copy of a royal bond. By candlelight, he knows it's not just a piece of paper. It's a sword hanging invisibly above his head. If he opposes a royal policy, he risks the forfeit. If his steward commits an error, the crown may collect. Every decision becomes a risk. This system bred resentment, but it also bred order. Henry placed his trust in clerks, not warriors. His most feared servant was Edmund Dudley, a lawyer. Together with Sir Richard Empson, they ran the Council Learned in the Law, a dry-sounding committee that became one of the most resented forces in the kingdom. Its job was to enforce the king's financial rights with no appeal and no mercy. Letters from that era are filled with dread. One nobleman's scribe noted, "Better to be called by death than to be called before Dudley." What made Dudley so feared was not just his loyalty to Henry, but his creativity. He and his team dug through centuries-old legal records to find obscure rights and feudal obligations. If your great-grandfather had promised to maintain a royal road and the ditch beside it had since crumbled, Dudley could find you liable. If your tenants had failed to deliver eggs to the local castle once in spring, that failure could be construed as a breach of royal loyalty. These were not crimes of rebellion or heresy. They were technicalities. But Henry made them matter. Behind this system was Henry's obsession with record-keeping. He kept what we might today call audit journals in his personal chambers. Historians refer to these as the King's Chamber Books, and they remain among the most detailed financial records from any European monarch of the period. He wrote notes in the margins. He underlined odd figures. He sometimes added little check marks or circled unusual entries. Some entries are surprisingly mundane. To a woman who sang to the Queen during supper, 5 shillings. Or, for mending the roof of the kitchen larder, 3 shillings, 8 pence. But others show a mind ever on alert. One entry notes a payment to an informant for discovering the false dealings of a merchant of Calais. Another details a sudden demand for payment from a duke who had failed to pay previous levies, to be paid within 30 days, or forfeiture begins. Henry VII's idea of kingship was deeply rooted in control. Not emotional, fiery control, but cold, calculated, written control. The kind that could be stored in a box, the kind that could be stamped with a seal. He travelled little, unlike monarchs of the past who had toured their kingdoms in grand progressions. Henry preferred to stay in one place, often Richmond Palace or Eltham Palace, surrounded by clerks and ledgers. His communication with distant regions happened through letters and messengers, not personal visits. To him, the kingdom was a flow of information, not a geography, but his system had vulnerabilities. It created silence where conversation once ruled. It built fear where loyalty had once been bought with favors, and it replaced charisma with contracts. This was perhaps most apparent in his relationship with the nobility. Many resented the absence of patronage. In previous reigns, a nobleman might expect lands or titles for loyalty. Under Henry, he often received little more than a nod and the removal of a bond. They were no longer rewarded with celebration. They were simply not punished. Over time, this lack of warmth created tension, even among loyalists. Though they obeyed him, they rarely loved him. One courtier, writing years later, said, "We served him because we feared him, not because we admired him." But still, Henry endured. His reign saw no major uprisings after the early threats were crushed. The country grew wealthier, trade improved, and for once, there was no war with France. Yet perhaps the most telling detail is this. Upon his death, his son Henry VIII ordered the arrest of Dudley and Empson almost immediately. The council learned was dismantled. Its records were burned. The bonds were cancelled. It was as if the new king wanted to erase his father's shadow of caution and start anew, with grandeur, with noise, with pageantry. So then we are left to wonder, did Henry VII save the kingdom with this quiet tyranny, or merely pass the burden to his son, who would explode in reaction? By the time Henry VII lay dying in April 1509, England was not celebrating. There were no jubilant crowds or great laments echoing through the cathedrals. The news passed quietly, as it often had during his rule. The man who had once ended civil war, solidified the throne, and flooded royal coffers with coins and caution, was gone. In his place stood a boy of just 17, charismatic, athletic, flamboyant, Henry VIII. But before that boy rewrote the monarchy in fire and song, let us linger a moment longer in the last, still corridors of Henry VII's reign. His will was brief and controlled, just like his governance. He left behind no towering statue, no epic poem in his honor, no flourishing military conquest to be inscribed on shields or arches. Instead, he left behind ledgers, records so detailed, so comprehensive, that historians hundreds of years later still sift through them to understand how the Tudor state functioned. He had, in a very boring and very powerful way, professionalized monarchy. The final years of his reign were not triumphant, but tense. Henry had become increasingly reclusive. Illness crept into his limbs. He had suffered the loss of his beloved wife, Elizabeth of York, and their eldest son, Arthur, whose death had shaken the succession. With Arthur gone, the burden fell to the younger son, Henry, who had been trained not to rule, but to pray. And yet, the younger Henry had watched. He had seen the careful notebooks, the fear in the eyes of lords summoned to court, the absence of celebration at the table. He had witnessed a kingship of silence, and while he might have admired his father's success, he seemed determined to do the opposite. But what of the realm Henry VII left behind? In 1509, England was not yet an empire. It was still modest, rich in wool, shy in diplomacy, cautious in expansion, but it was secure. There were reserves of gold stored in secret chests. Government offices functioned with new efficiency. Taxes were predictable. Roads had been surveyed. The nobility, though still potent, had been trimmed down in power. One of Henry's final acts had been to commission the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. It was, ironically, one of the most extravagant constructions of the age, a vaulted, intricate, light-filled architectural gem. To this day, his tomb lies there in black marble, beneath the elaborate ceiling he never lived to see completed. That chapel remains one of the only visible legacies of a king who preferred paper to proclamation. The rest of his impact lies beneath, in the civil service he shaped, in the accounting methods he enforced, in the idea that a king could govern by systems rather than sword. Some historians now view him as a pioneer of modern governance, an early architect of bureaucratic monarchy, where stability mattered more than spectacle. And yet, his legacy was fragile. The moment his son ascended the throne, the restraint broke. Henry VIII cancelled the debts. He dissolved the council learned. He beheaded Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, men who had once been extensions of the king's will. He married quickly, spent lavishly, and declared war on France soon after. It was not just a change in leadership, it was an eruption. Some scholars believe that Henry VII's quiet rule created a dam, holding back the chaos of royal ambition. And when the dam cracked, the flood was all the greater. But if we step back, if we ignore the noise that followed, we might see the first Tudor king for what he truly was, a man who saw the throne not as a stage, but as a desk, who saw his people not as subjects to be adored or feared, but as entries in a larger table, rows and rows of incomes, fines, oaths, and outcomes. In some ways, he was England's first accountant king, and the fact that he succeeded in preserving peace for over 2 decades is no small legacy, even if he did it with sealed boxes, silent servants, and softly spoken commands. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think not of kings in armor or on horseback, but of one thin man in a candle-lit chamber, reviewing parchment by the inch, wearing a robe patched at the elbow, with a ledger open across his lap. Because sometimes, the most enduring power is the kind you never hear coming. And that leaves us to wonder, how many other kings in history shaped nations not by what they said aloud, but by what they quietly wrote down, sealed in wax and tucked into a drawer. Louis IX of France is best remembered as a saint, a man of immense piety, revered for his crusading zeal and moral virtue, canonized by the Catholic Church just 27 years after his death. But beneath the stained glass glow of sainthood lies a different story, quieter, steadier, and infinitely more boring. One of forms, files, memoranda, and the slow rise of state infrastructure. For Louis IX was not just a holy king, he was also an administrative pioneer, a ruler whose greatest battles may have been fought with ink rather than iron. Our story begins in the mid-13th century, when France was not yet a unified nation, but a collection of feudal lands, each ruled by lords with their own laws, weights, taxes, and tempers. Louis IX inherited this from his father, King Louis VIII, along with the scars of ongoing crusades and a royal treasury in need of discipline. Where most medieval kings sought to stamp out dissent with force, Louis took a different approach. He codified it. He listened. He wrote things down. And he expected his subjects to do the same. In fact, Louis IX's court was known not just for its formality, but for its paperwork. Royal scribes, sometimes over 100 in number, toiled day and night in what was effectively a bureaucratic engine, copying royal decrees, recording land grants, indexing taxes, and compiling complaints. These scribes worked in what came to be known as the Chancery, the central administrative office of the king's government. Their tools were simple, quill pens, parchment, sand to blot the ink, but their influence was profound. Louis created systems for appeals from lower courts, allowing peasants and townspeople to bring their cases before the king's justices, a concept revolutionary at the time. He even allowed his own royal court to be corrected if a mistake was found. Imagine that, a medieval king willing to admit legal error and institutionalize the correction of it. He standardized coinage. He banned trial by ordeal. And he made it clear that laws should be consistent, predictable, and, above all, written. Travelers in Louis IX's France often remarked, not just on the cleanliness of roads or the price of bread, but on the behavior of the king's officials. Royal inspectors known as enquêteurs were sent throughout the realm. Their job? To investigate corruption and abuse among local lords and sheriffs. But unlike spies or soldiers, these agents were required to write extensive reports, not for dramatic effect, but for archival reference. Each accusation was cross-referenced. Each fine or bribe had to be proven. It was a kingdom slowly shifting from whim to rule, from noise to note-taking. Even Louis's personal conduct was emblematic of his system. He held court beneath a large oak tree in Vincennes, not just for show, but because it was where commoners could approach him directly. He would listen to disputes between townsmen, clerics, and knights, and afterward, he would instruct a clerk to record the decision and send a copy to the regional bailiff. These written decisions began to accumulate. Over time, they formed the basis of a more centralized legal system, one not dependent on noble privilege or local custom. To modern ears, these developments might seem dull. After all, what is exciting about a king who preferred order to opulence? But consider the world in which Louis ruled. It was a time when kings were expected to lead armies, host elaborate feasts, marry for power, and crush opposition without debate. Louis, by contrast, imposed quiet. He demanded structure. He wanted answers to come from scrolls, not swords, and he practiced what he preached. He fasted regularly. He refused to wear fine clothes, preferring simple woolen tunics. He washed the feet of beggars in public. He kept a personal ledger of charitable donations, and he reviewed it often. There are even accounts of him correcting the handwriting of junior scribes and redrafting letters that lacked appropriate tone or clarity. His personal library was small but meticulously maintained. He carried with him not just the Bible, but law codes, prayer manuals, and civic texts. He once told his son that the key to good kingship was not strength, but restraint. Rule not in anger, he wrote, and seek not vengeance where you may find justice. In the royal kitchens, staff had strict instructions on portioning and waste. A list of kitchen expenses from 1254 shows weekly tallies of grain, wine, and poultry, all annotated with notes in the margins. 2 chickens unfit, bread returned, wine short by 1 measure, replaced. The same attention to detail was mirrored in military supply ledgers and diplomatic correspondence. Louis's reign also saw the rise of administrative French as the written language of law. Latin remained in use, of course, but more and more, royal documents were being issued in the language of the people. This was not a cultural decision. It was an administrative one. Fewer translation errors, clearer meaning, less room for dispute. Even the sacred was systematized. Louis IX funded the construction of Sainte-Chapelle, one of the most beautiful Gothic buildings in Europe. It was built not just as a place of worship, but as a reliquary, a storage space for holy objects, including the crown of thorns. And like everything else under Louis's reign, the chapel came with written inventory records, detailing where each relic was kept, how it had been obtained, and its appropriate display conditions. One scholar who visited Sainte-Chapelle during Louis's lifetime noted with admiration and a bit of exhaustion that even the order of candles was regulated by hour. It is difficult to overstate just how rare this kind of governance was in the 1200s. Louis IX was not a reformer in the plain sense of revolution. He did not overthrow systems or challenge theological orthodoxy. He simply tightened the screws on what already existed. He asked again and again that officials write it down, and slowly, as the years passed, France began to resemble not just a kingdom, but a state. But this raises a question, and one that lingers across centuries. Did Louis's quiet dedication to paperwork make him holy, or was sainthood simply the only title left to reward a king who governed too quietly for legend? As Louis IX's reign moved into its second decade, the rhythm of administration had become a feature of daily life across France. Townspeople paid taxes with predictable regularity. Royal envoys appeared on market days to review records, not to collect oaths of fealty. Bailiffs submitted monthly summaries of grain harvests, cattle disputes, and weather-related delays in bridge repairs. It was not thrilling, but it worked. Louis believed deeply that the authority of a monarch was grounded not in spectacle, but in stability. And for him, that meant rules, precise, repeatable, written rules. One of his most impactful and least glamorous contributions was his reform of the royal judiciary. While previous kings had left much of the legal system in the hands of powerful local nobles, Louis extended the authority of the Parlement of Paris, not a legislative body in the modern sense, but a supreme court responsible for hearing appeals from across the kingdom. Under Louis, the Parlement became the central legal institution of France. Clerks meticulously recorded proceedings. Petitions were numbered, copied, and archived. A judgment issued in Paris could now supersede conflicting decisions made by a baron in Poitou or a count in Champagne. In essence, the law began to act like a national law even before France became a nation in the modern sense. To support this legal network, Louis expanded the number of royal justices, men trained in law and appointed to circuits across the country. These justices did not wear armor. They carried satchels of parchment, weighed disputes, and sent regular dispatches back to Paris. Local nobles were often skeptical of their authority, but they rarely dared to challenge it because their letters bore the king's seal. Louis, true to form, oversaw the operations closely. When he was not holding court or attending mass, he often met with legal clerks and administrative advisors. He read reports line by line. He is known to have corrected grammatical errors in court documents, and once famously had a scribe rewrite a judgment entirely because it lacked clarity and dignity in tone. Beyond law and finance, Louis also ventured into regulating commerce. He established royal weights and measures, creating standards that could be enforced across different regions. Bakers could no longer sell underweight loaves without consequence. Cloth merchants were inspected for false yardage. The royal inspectors, still called enquêteurs, carried pocket-sized standards with them on their rounds. This was not just a symbolic gesture. A standardized marketplace was an economic game-changer. It meant a merchant from Reims could do business in Toulouse with some confidence that his scales would be honored. It also made tax collection easier, and Louis, who disliked new taxes, relied instead on consistency. His goal was not to grow rich, it was to grow predictable. It's easy to miss the magnitude of such decisions, but their impact was cumulative. Over time, the fragmented feudal France of Louis's youth had become a more cohesive organism, linked not by shared culture alone, but by a web of administrative habits, records, forms, procedures, a subtle unity through clerical repetition. Even Louis's crusading efforts, the most dramatic part of his legacy, were executed with bureaucratic precision. In 1248, he launched the Seventh Crusade, not in a blaze of chaos, but with ledgers and supply orders. Ships were chartered, food inventories were calculated down to the weight of dried fish and the volume of wine per soldier. A surviving document lists the precise number of mules, spare boots, bundles of linen, barrels of vinegar, and spare sails to be sent to Aigues-Mortes, the southern port he used for departure. While the campaign ultimately failed, Louis was captured. In Egypt, the logistical effort itself had been enormous. He negotiated prisoner ransoms through intermediaries. He drafted and signed safe passage letters. His personal notebooks from this period record shipments of soap, thread, and palm oil, sent from Acre to camps near Damietta. Even in captivity, Louis governed by the book. He issued instructions to his regents in France during his absence, emphasizing financial prudence and religious observance. While his enemies mocked him as too mild, too pious, even too dull, the kingdom did not collapse in his absence. It functioned because the mechanisms he built were no longer entirely reliant on his physical presence, and that was, in its own way, revolutionary. Kings had always claimed to be the embodiment of state. Louis, instead, made the state an apparatus, something that could run, if slowly, on wheels and ink and reports. For every failed military adventure, there was a smoother tax record. For every lost battle, a more accurate inventory. His return from crusade was not triumphant. He arrived in France weakened, older, humbled by the experience of war. And yet he seemed more devoted than ever to the quiet details of kingship. He doubled down on charity. He reduced courtly expenses. He pushed further reforms in judicial procedure, ordering that oral testimony be documented more systematically to prevent error or manipulation. And always he kept writing. His letters to his son Philip contain more guidance on moral behavior, reading habits, and proper care of officials than on conquest or legacy. One line reads, "If you appoint a bailiff, see that he be neither greedy nor swift to anger, and always ask if he has learned to write, for a man who does not write cannot remember what he has sworn." It's a sentence that captures Louis in full. There is a tendency, even today, to glorify kings who expand borders, conquer lands, or live in notorious luxury. But Louis IX offered a different image, the invisible king, working quietly, steadily, until his kingdom operated almost in spite of him. But it leaves us with a question, one he never asked aloud, but perhaps inscribed in silence. Can a king, who governs best, be the one most easily forgotten in the moment, remembered only in the systems that quietly endure after he is gone? By the final decade of Louis IX's reign, France no longer resembled the fragmented feudal patchwork he had inherited. What had once been a collection of competing customs, isolated provinces, and local power brokers now pulsed to the rhythm of royal procedure. Though few recognized it at the time, Louis had laid the groundwork for a very modern concept. The state as a machine, composed of offices, signatures, and an ever-growing mountain of records. Louis spent his last years in a rhythm of disciplined repetition. He rose early for mass, took limited meals, reviewed correspondence, held court in deliberate stillness, and drafted policies with a patience that often exhausted those around him. He rarely showed anger. He disliked interruptions. And when he traveled, he took with him not only chaplains and guards, but boxes of scrolls, scribes, and seal-bearers. It was not glamour, it was governance. His charity, widely remembered, was not impulsive. It was structured. Louis established hospitals that were not just acts of piety, but institutions with ledgers. The Hospice of 15 Vins in Paris, for example, served 300 blind residents and kept records of linen inventories, staff salaries, donated alms, and even meal schedules, divided into fasting and feast days. He also established what were essentially early welfare programs. Widows of knights received pensions. Orphans under royal protection were tracked in registers, their guardians vetted for honesty. Monasteries receiving royal grants had to submit reports on their spending. This was not merely kindness, it was accountable kindness, reinforced by documentation. Louis's belief in the written word extended even into the spiritual. He commissioned translations of religious texts into French and instructed that sermons be recorded and circulated. His personal collection of devotions included hand-copied psalters with marginalia he annotated himself. He once told a fellow monarch that books are the safest counselors, for they do not flatter nor grow weary. But he did not retreat into contemplation entirely. In 1270, at the age of 56, Louis launched his final crusade. It was not inspired by political strategy or military opportunity. It was born from an unshakable sense of duty. Despite his failing health and years of governance, Louis believed that kings must also sacrifice. So he set sail once more, this time to Tunis. Even this campaign was handled with his signature method. The crusade was planned as a supply operation first, a battle second. He consulted physicians, engineers, and naval architects. Quartermasters documented every shipment. Before departing, he left behind a council of regency with carefully drafted letters of instruction, covering everything from regional justice cases to grain reserves. The Tunis campaign, however, was doomed from the outset. The summer was cruel, the water was foul, dysentery swept through the camp, and Louis himself fell ill within weeks. His final days were quiet, not marked by fanfare, but by a slow collapse of breath and body. He died on August 25th, 1270, not in battle, but on a cot in the sand, surrounded not by cheering knights, but by scribes and clerics recording his words. The immediate reaction in France was not explosion, but a strange silence. Courtiers wept, but not dramatically. Clergy mourned in robes. Royal offices remained open, because everything had already been arranged. Louis had planned for his death with files, directives, and instructions sealed in wax. His son, Philip III, returned to a France that was unusually prepared for succession. There was no scramble for power. The legal and fiscal systems functioned. The monasteries received their grants on schedule. The Parlement of Paris continued hearing appeals. The royal clerks filed entries as they had the week before. And so, in death, Louis IX proved his greatest point. The king may pass, but the paper lives on. His canonization came swiftly, declared a saint in 1297. But even that act, once seen as the final crowning of his holy legacy, now seems only part of the picture. For while his sainthood was based on faith, chastity, and charity, his deeper and quieter legacy was governmental. Over the following centuries, French kings cited Louis IX not for his miracles, but for his reforms. Lawmakers referred back to his edicts. Archivists studied his chancery protocols. His example became the gold standard for administrative piety. A king whose rule was so methodical that even holy work had a paper trail. The systems he put in place of appeal, inspection, and record-keeping lasted into the modern era. They evolved into bureaucracies, civil codes, and departments of state. And even after revolutions reshaped the throne, the quiet foundations he laid continued to guide French governance. So, as you lie in bed, listening to the wind outside or the faint ticking of a clock, remember this: not all kings ride to glory on horses. Some build their legacy from scrolls and seals, from the scratch of a pen and the silence of a reading room. In the end, Louis IX was more than a saint. He was a scribe with a crown, and his France was his manuscript. And that leaves us with one final thought. As the candle flickers low, what other kings of history, now obscured by louder names, reshaped their nations not with thunder, but with the whisper of turning pages? Long before the Tudors, before the Plantagenets, even before the Normans crossed the Channel, there sat a quiet and often confused monarch on the throne of England. Æthelred the Second, better remembered by his unfortunate nickname, the Unready. But in Old English, unread did not mean unprepared. It meant poorly advised. And so Æthelred the Unready was not so much careless as he was surrounded by hesitation, weak guidance, and an overwhelming fondness for not deciding things. He reigned for nearly 40 years in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, during which time England was both expanding and under siege. Viking raids resumed with force. Taxes were levied, monasteries were plundered, fortresses were fortified, then abandoned. And through it all, King Æthelred issued orders, revoked them, prayed, paid ransoms, and revised his strategies so often that even his advisors lost track. The early years of his rule began under a dark cloud. He came to the throne in 978 AD, at the age of about 12, after the suspicious murder of his older half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. Æthelred's mother, Queen Æthelred, may have played a role in Edward's death, though the truth was never formally established. What mattered most at court was that the boy king was crowned fast. Before rivals could rally, the archbishop anointed him, and just like that, he was king of the English. But England in Æthelred's time was a patchwork of shires, local lords, and monasteries. The central government barely existed beyond the king's household and his royal court, or witan, an assembly of bishops and noblemen who advised him but held no fixed power. It was a government of custom and reaction, not planning and foresight. The result was a reign that unfolded like a series of scribbled footnotes, one decision reacting to another, often without context or continuity. One of the key features of Æthelred's administration was the introduction of a tax called the Danegeld. It was, quite literally, money paid to Viking invaders so they would go away. The logic was simple. War cost lives and treasure. Paying off the enemy was cheaper. At first, the sums were manageable. In 991, after the Battle of Maldon, a defeat. For the English, Æthelred agreed to pay the Danes £10,000 of silver. It was a staggering sum, equivalent to millions today, but it bought peace. For a time. But like all payments to bullies, it set a precedent. The Danes returned. Again and again. And each time, Æthelred raised the tax higher, draining the royal treasury and angering landowners. One payment reached £48,000, a fortune collected from a patchy network of taxes that often required weeks of negotiations in local courts and meetings at dusty stone halls. The system to collect the geld was rudimentary. Tax officials, called gerifas, travelled by horseback, often without guards, carrying wooden tally sticks and parchment. They assessed landowners, collected payments in silver coin, and scribbled receipts with bone styli on wax tablets. Many of these scribes were monks, working in cold rooms with flickering candles, copying figures that would later be carried to Winchester or London to be counted. But these payments did not buy peace. They bought time. The raids continued. Æthelred responded with a flurry of law codes, each one slightly revised from the last. Legal scribes in cloisters compiled them in Latin and Old English, recording rules about land inheritance, the harbouring of enemies, and the obligations of military service. These codes were issued with solemn ceremony, and then often ignored. Even the coinage of Æthelred's reign reflects the instability. His silver pennies, struck in mints like York and Canterbury, changed designs frequently. Sometimes the king's face appeared stern, sometimes awkwardly boyish. Mint officials may have altered the image to suit local preferences or to disguise the fact that currency was being debased. Less silver, more filler. His foreign policy was equally indecisive. At one point, he tried to forge alliances through marriage, wedging himself into the tangled web of continental nobility. In 1002, Æthelred married Emma of Normandy, a shrewd and pragmatic noblewoman who would later become one of the most powerful figures in early medieval England. The marriage was strategic, aimed at stopping the Normans from aiding the Vikings, but the results were mixed. That same year, Æthelred ordered one of the most infamous decisions of his reign, the St. Brice's Day massacre, an attempt to eliminate Danish settlers living in England. The order was brutal and poorly executed. Not only did it fail to remove the threat, it enraged Viking leaders. Chief among them was Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark, whose sister may have been among the victims. Sweyn retaliated with an invasion. Over the next decade, Æthelred's kingdom fell into a cycle of fear, payments, and poorly coordinated defense. Local lords built fortifications, but few shared resources. Royal messengers carried orders that often conflicted. Some regions refused to send men to battle unless the king showed up himself. Others fought valiantly, only to be left unsupported. And through it all, Æthelred's court scribes kept writing. They documented land charters, law revisions, ecclesiastical donations, and recorded fines. They wrote instructions for the provisioning of troops and drafted homilies calling for national repentance. One surviving royal charter from 1009 lists no fewer than 50 signatories, each trying to clarify land rights that were already in dispute. In the king's name, messengers were dispatched to warn of attacks, and bishops were consulted on port defences. But the royal hand remained weak, less a command than a suggestion couched in ceremony. By the time Æthelred fled London in 1013, as Sweyn Forkbeard seized the capital, it was clear that his reign was crumbling. He and his family escaped to Normandy, sheltered by his wife's kin. It seemed his kingship had ended, but the story was not over. Sweyn died suddenly in 1014, and Æthelred returned to the throne. Older, wearier, still indecisive, he reigned for just 2 more years, dying in 1016 after a life defined not by triumph, but by exhaustion. And yet, the story is more than failure. Æthelred's reign gave rise to an explosion of documentation. His law codes, though often ineffective, in practice, formed the bedrock of later Anglo-Saxon legal tradition. His coinage, though inconsistent, was minted in more places than any of his predecessors. His charters, scribbled across sheepskin and stored in damp vaults, became a chronicle of a country trying to survive its own disunity. Even in confusion, there was construction. Even in hesitation, there was preservation. But this leaves us with a quiet, lingering question. Can a king who faltered at every turn still shape a kingdom simply by writing things down, even if no one followed what was written? By the time Æthelred returned from Normandy in 1014, after his brief exile, he was no longer a boy king. He was a man in his mid-40s, returning not to a secure kingdom, but to a frightened and fragmented one. The Vikings had already burned and ravaged the eastern coasts. London had surrendered. Trade was disrupted. Food was scarce in some shires. Yet what greeted Æthelred was not outright revolt. It was resigned acceptance, the sort that comes when people are simply too exhausted to resist. And so, the scribes returned to work. The clerks at Winchester and Worcester sharpened their knives to trim parchment. Quills were dipped, charters resumed. Æthelred, though weakened, still held the royal seal, and with it came the business of monarchy, grants of land, privileges to abbots, reaffirmations of loyalty. It was not glory, it was paperwork. His first act upon return was largely symbolic. He pledged to rule more justly than before, a statement that echoed like an apology. He promised that he would no longer levy unfair taxes, no longer ignore his nobles, no longer abandon his oaths. And once again, scribes recorded this new resolution with formal phrasing and Latin margin notes. But the reality was familiar. The danger had not passed. Sweyn Forkbeard's son, Canute, remained in England. He had a fleet, soldiers, and a growing number of allies, some English, some Danish settlers, and some simply opportunistic. Æthelred, meanwhile, began drafting orders for military preparations that were painfully late. The system he relied on for defense was the fyrd, a form of militia called up from the landowning classes. It was slow, inconsistent, and deeply localized. One shire might respond promptly, another might delay, citing poor harvests or fear of Viking retaliation. The king had no standing army, only obligations, and many of those obligations were muddled by uncertain land records. That, too, was a problem of paperwork. Land ownership in late Anglo-Saxon England was recorded through charters, legal documents that traced who had granted what to whom and with what conditions. But during Æthelred's reign, these records multiplied to such an extent that contradictions became common. Lords challenged one another's rights in court, citing old charters or claiming the king had promised overlapping lands to different people. To address this, Æthelred's chancery began issuing confirmations, essentially royal endorsements that tried to validate earlier land grants. A surviving confirmation from 1015 includes language clarifying a field boundary using a stream, a twisted oak, and a large standing stone with a bird carved in its side. These natural landmarks served as legal borders, and they were often annotated by monks who were instructed to witness the spot themselves. But these efforts only slowed the chaos. Canute began attacking in earnest. He moved methodically, securing coastal strongholds, then striking inland. Æthelred issued orders, retreated, negotiated and fortified towns. But his greatest efforts, ironically, focused not on offense, but on legal reform. In 1014 and 1015, he issued new law codes in an attempt to bind the kingdom through shared procedure. The codes covered everything from military service obligations to punishments for theft and the treatment of foreign merchants. These were distributed across monasteries and were meant to be read aloud in assemblies and courts. One clause decreed that any man who neglected his fyrd duty was to lose his property, unless pardoned by the king. Another banned trade with Danish settlements, unless certified by a local reeve. These regulations weren't always enforceable, but they reflected a desperate attempt to impose clarity in a time of collapsing order. Meanwhile, the economy suffered. Coinage continued, but the quality of silver declined. Some pennies were so debased that traders refused them. A mint in the north was found producing irregular weights, and the local reeve who oversaw it was fined, then replaced by a relative of the king, a move that stirred resentment but maintained control. Despite the failures in policy, the administrative structure remained active. It is in Æthelred's time that we see the foundations of what later became more formalized systems of English bureaucracy. The office of the sheriff, for instance, originally the king's local tax collector and law enforcer, took on more defined duties. Sheriffs reported to royal clerks, submitted tallies of collected Danegeld, and occasionally offered advice on local defense. Their letters survive, many written with hurried hands, noting everything from horse shortages to quarrels between local priests and reeves. Religious institutions remained central to the crown's reach. Abbeys served as both legal centers and logistical hubs. Monks administered land, stored grain, and copied legal documents for distribution. The king leaned heavily on the church, not for spiritual authority alone, but because it was the most literate network in the country. He granted land to bishops in exchange for loyalty, and received in return legal opinions, letters of appeal, and even military assistance, though usually limited to supplies and messengers. Emma of Normandy, Æthelred's wife, played a growing, role during these years. Educated, shrewd and fluent in both Norman and Anglo-Saxon legal culture, she managed estates and maintained correspondence with foreign allies. One preserved letter shows her reminding a bishop that land he administered remained technically under her protection, and that she expected a yearly report of harvest yields. This letter, in carefully inked Latin, ends with a polite but firm directive to consider what the king himself would wish. Æthelred, though often seen as weak, was not idle. He simply never found a strategy that worked. He was a ruler overwhelmed by the demands of kingship, forced to rely on men who gave him conflicting advice, reacting to crises faster than his system could handle. His efforts were many. He rebuilt bridges destroyed by raiders. He ordered church bells recast after fires. He appointed judges to shire courts. He wrote to the Pope seeking advice. And always, he commissioned copies of law codes, written, rewritten, glossed by monks, and sent to the corners of the realm. But the end was drawing near. By 1016, Canute had advanced deep into the country. Æthelred's eldest son, Edmund Ironside, rallied armies and led resistance. Æthelred, now ill and likely demoralized, issued a final round of royal writs, commands to prepare stores of food, secure roads, and pray. Then, in April of that year, King Æthelred died. He left behind a kingdom in flux, neither conquered nor secure, filled with law codes that had been read aloud but rarely enforced, and a treasury depleted by decades of desperate peace payments. And yet, even in defeat, the apparatus of governance that had been expanded during his reign would outlive him. For what is bureaucracy, if not the enduring echo of authority, even when that authority is doubted? And so we are left with a question, almost whispered through vellum pages and royal seals. Was Æthelred's reign a failure, or was it the slow, stumbling beginning of something England didn't yet know it needed? A state held together by ink when iron could no longer hold. The line? Æthelred the Unready's final months passed in a fog of decay and distraction. London was under siege. The coasts were burning again. His health was fading, and the young warriors of England, rallying under his son Edmund Ironside, increasingly looked to battle rather than the old king's charters for leadership. Yet even as the kingdom buckled under Viking pressure, the royal scribes continued their work. Charters were still issued. Land disputes were still arbitrated. Priories still received grants, though the margins now contained scribbled pleas. Due to the burden of geld, let this be postponed until harvest. The chancery, such as it was, did not cease when the shield wall broke, because it was not built on glory. It was built on record-keeping. At the moment of Æthelred's death in April 1016, England was in a rare and miserable position, a kingdom with two competing kings. His son Edmund Ironside was declared king by the nobles of London, but Canute, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, declared himself king elsewhere, and as battles raged across the south, Æthelred's own bureaucratic legacy was ignored, altered, or repurposed, and yet, curiously, not erased. Canute, once he gained full control of the English throne in late 1016, did not destroy Æthelred's systems. He adapted them. He kept many of the same reeves and sheriffs. He relied on the same scribes. And in one of the oddest ironies of medieval kingship, Canute governed England using the administrative tools that Æthelred had left behind. He continued to collect danegeld, though under slightly new terms. He issued charters in Latin and Old English. He confirmed laws that had first been outlined under Æthelred's name. The very machinery of English rule, though mocked and mismanaged under Æthelred, was surprisingly durable, because it was not based on the strength of one man. It was based on a culture of writing. Æthelred's legal scribes had, for all their inefficiency, begun something lasting. They had taken the sprawling, sometimes contradictory customs of the land and tried to name them, organize them, write them into patterns. They had classified offenses, codified punishments, and drafted phrases that would echo in law codes for generations. In some of the surviving law books from this period, you find evidence of this slow shaping. Lists of duties and dues, phrased with cautious balance. Let the lord give fair hearing. Let the tenant pay according to agreement. Let tithes be offered in good measure. These were not decrees shouted from horseback. They were suggestions, with authority, carved into parchment with bone pens. And these documents survived, even in the chaos of conquest. Monasteries safeguarded them. Monks copied them. New kings cited them. Æthelred may have died in weakness, but his words, structured, revised, issued with seals, persisted. There is a certain kind of strength in that. Centuries later, historians and legal scholars began to see Æthelred differently, not as the incompetent weakling caricatured in post-conquest chronicles, but as a transitional figure, a king at the edge of two eras, trying to rule a medieval society that was becoming too complex for intuition. Alone. His nickname, Unread, often misunderstood as unready, more accurately means ill-advised, and in many ways, that is correct. He listened poorly. He changed decisions mid-course. He distrusted his counselors, then over-relied on them. But at the same time, he wrote things down. He ordered the copying of law. He reviewed the coinage. He approved charters. He supported churches not just with land, but with instructions, small but vital nudges toward order. And when the next generation came, Edmund, then Canute, then Edward the Confessor, they governed with many of those same tools. They built upon Æthelred's dull foundation. A century after his death, some of Æthelred's charters were still being used to settle legal disputes. The Abbey of Abingdon quoted one to defend a land claim. A cathedral court in Winchester referenced his coinage in a ruling on weights and fraud. These were not acts of admiration. They were acts of administrative inheritance. Because kingdoms, it turns out, do not last on valor alone. They endure on habits, on records, on the tedious work of small offices keeping things from falling apart. Æthelred's reign may not have inspired loyalty or won decisive wars, but he left behind something harder to notice and harder to destroy, a skeleton of state. So as you fall asleep tonight, picture not the battlefield, but the chancery. Imagine a low-ceilinged room, a monk bent over a wax tablet, copying a tax figure by candlelight, a draft of a law about bridge maintenance, a king's seal faintly pressed, a ledger left open on a table made of elm, where a tired clerk has just risen for evening prayer. There is no triumph in this moment, but there is continuity, and in that, perhaps Æthelred did something rare for his time. He ruled poorly, but laid down rules that could outlast him. And so we ask, can even a failed king be great if the silence of his writing ends up guiding those who come after, long after his voice has faded from memory? It is easy to remember Philip II of Spain for the towering symbols, the Spanish Armada, the sprawling Habsburg Empire, the vast gold fleets from the New World. But behind all of that, beneath the silver, beyond the war banners, was a man sitting in a chair, quietly overwhelmed by paperwork. Philip II did not see kingship as a theatrical act. He saw it as a task that never ended. He was not a warrior by nature, nor was he a charismatic ruler. He was quiet, pale, deeply Catholic, and above all methodical. So methodical, in fact, that his ministers sometimes waited weeks for him to respond to simple letters, because he insisted on reading every single piece of correspondence himself, even the most minor. He kept records. He cross-checked drafts. He annotated margins with iron gall ink. And in the royal palace he built for himself, the grand but strangely cold El Escorial, Philip created something more than a residence. He created a filing system. From the moment he took control of the Spanish Empire in the mid-16th century, Philip II faced a monumental task. His inheritance was not just the throne of Spain, but a scattered empire that spanned the world. From Naples to the Netherlands, from Mexico to Manila, Philip had to govern an ocean of territories with thousands of officials, languages, currencies, and customs, and he chose to govern it all by hand. Philip believed that kings must see everything, so he demanded personal copies of nearly all reports, from grain shortages in Valencia to weather damage in a Peruvian silver mine. These were brought to him in baskets and boxes. He would sit, alone for hours, reading each one. Sometimes he signed them. Sometimes he wrote notes. Often, he simply moved them into a growing pile labeled, "To review again." El Escorial became not only a royal residence, but a paper fortress. There were rooms lined with shelves, stacked with scrolls, maps, inventories, and letters. Clerks shuffled constantly through narrow halls, filing dispatches. Royal secretaries took dictation while standing, as Philip often paced while reviewing documents. When he sat, It was in a straight-backed chair at a plain desk, his eyes lowered, his fingers busy separating pages that sometimes stuck together with humidity. He rarely smiled, he rarely travelled, but his thoughts went everywhere. In a single day, Philip might review reports from New Spain about gold shipments, read letters from Dutch provinces about religious tensions, scan petitions from Italian nobles requesting exemptions from salt taxes, and finally issue instructions on monastic property rights in Aragon. This was not bureaucracy for its own sake. To Philip, information was control. He did not trust intermediaries to interpret reports for him. He had learned early, especially in the Netherlands, that delegated power could lead to rebellion. His rule, he believed, must flow not from ministers, but from his own pen. And yet, the sheer scale of the empire overwhelmed even his discipline. Documents arrived faster than he could read them. The papelada, a term his own staff used, to describe the flood of documents, sometimes buried desks and spilled into hallways. One minister described the Escorial's corridors as the veins of a giant creature filled with blood made of paper. To manage this flow, Philip created one of the earliest centralized bureaucratic states. He divided his empire into councils: the Council of the Indies, the Council of Italy, the Council of Finance, and others. Each was responsible for its own domain, but each was still required to submit summaries to the king. Philip reviewed the minutes, crossed out sections, asked for clarification, or simply wrote "seen," which meant he had read it, even if he had nothing to add. It could take 6 months for a decision to travel from Lima to Madrid, and another 6 to return. And still, Philip insisted on central review. He even read complaints from peasants. A bundle of petitions from a village near Toledo survives, in which local farmers plead for relief from water tariffs. The language is rough, the ink uneven, but at the bottom of the 3rd page, in Philip's own hand, is a short note. Have the matter examined. Let it not be delayed further. His obsession with detail extended to architecture. The El Escorial itself was designed in the shape of a grid, a deliberate reflection of order. Its layout resembled a printed page, symmetrical, contained, organized. Even the king's personal chambers were placed directly beneath the chapel's altar, so that he might sleep literally under God's presence. And yet, for all this precision, the world refused to behave. Wars erupted. The Dutch provinces revolted. England remained defiant. The Armada failed. His armies fought in France and Italy. His treasuries strained under the weight of debt and silver inflation. And through it all, Philip kept reading, kept writing it. It's said that during particularly difficult times, when court factions argued or battles dragged on, Philip would retreat to a small inner room with only his desk and one lamp, where he would read silently for hours. No audience, no performance, just ink and worry. He suffered from gout. He aged badly. His sleep was erratic, but still, he read. And as the 16th century drew to a close, Spain remained intact. Not because of victory in battle, but because of structures, records, and the habits of review. But this leaves us with an oddly quiet question. Can a king who never saw half his empire rule it effectively, simply by insisting on reading every word written about it? By the middle of his reign, Philip II had begun to blur the line between ruler and clerk. His daily routine was rigid, beginning early and stretching deep into the night, dominated not by ceremony or leisure, but by correspondence. He rarely left El Escorial except when absolutely necessary. The palace became more than his administrative headquarters. It became a symbol of his mind, structured, repetitive, and always full of unfinished business. The flow of paper never stopped. Reports came from Milan, Naples, Lisbon, Seville, and Antwerp. They detailed ship manifests, trade tallies, grain shortages, the movement of soldiers, and the latest quarrels between bishops and governors. Each letter was sorted, read, and annotated, often with Philip's own remarks in Latin or in tight, angular Spanish. His insistence on handling everything personally caused long delays. Ambassadors sometimes waited months for simple replies. Colonial governors complained of inaction. Merchants grumbled at indecision. Yet within the walls of the Escorial, the king remained resolute, convinced that knowledge without personal review was dangerous. He believed that good governance came not from quick judgment but from patience. He once told a secretary that decisions were best when allowed to breathe. The kingdom, however, did not always agree. Spain's power at the time stretched across multiple continents. The demands of empire could not always wait for the king's ink to dry. Yet Philip continued, undeterred. He was not driven by ambition in the traditional sense. He was driven by responsibility, a belief that a king must be present in the smallest details. One of his most elaborate administrative systems was the Council of the Indies. It oversaw Spain's possessions in the Americas and Asia. Every shipment of silver, every mining license, every ecclesiastical appointment passed through it. Philip expected summaries of its decisions on a weekly basis. These summaries were sometimes 40 pages long, filled with numbers, footnotes, and updates. The king read them, marked them, and sometimes requested that earlier decisions be reviewed. This constant cycle of reading and revision frustrated many of his ministers, but it also created one of the most detailed archives of imperial administration in the early modern world. Philip's tendency to centralize power extended even into areas that had previously enjoyed local autonomy. In the Netherlands, where resistance to Spanish rule was rising, his refusal to delegate authority contributed to the outbreak of open revolt. Local leaders had expected some measure of negotiation. Instead, they received orders, delays, and silence. When rebellion erupted, Philip's response was slow but absolute. He sent the Duke of Alba with troops to enforce royal authority, leading to years of brutal repression. Even then, the king issued written orders for everything, from how executions were to be carried out to how captured towns were to be taxed. The same pattern played out in Portugal, which Philip claimed after the death of its childless king in 1580. Though he gained the crown, he continued to manage the country as if it were another province, expecting detailed reports from Lisbon and involving himself in appointments and policy. Portuguese officials complained of being micromanaged. Still, the documents flowed. The empire swelled, not with celebration, but with paper. Within the Escorial, the atmosphere reflected the king's disposition. The architecture was stark and austere. The walls were plain. The furnishings were minimal. The scribes worked in silence. Philip moved through the corridors like a shadow, passing between his chapel and his desk, sometimes carrying papers in, his hands muttering corrections to himself. He was rarely seen outdoors. When he dined, it was alone or with a small circle of trusted clerics and advisors. He spoke softly. He listened carefully. He trusted almost no one. Even the library of El Escorial, which he personally curated, revealed his view of kingship. It was filled not with romances or courtly literature, but with volumes of law, theology, geography, and technical manuals. There were books on fortification design, mining engineering, and botanical classification. Each one was catalogued. Many bore his personal seal. He believed that a king should understand the world through reading, not just ruling. As he aged, his body failed him. Gout crippled his hands and legs. He suffered from fevers and intestinal ailments, but he continued to read. His secretaries learned to carry papers to his bedside. On some days, he would dictate responses while soaking his swollen feet in hot water. Even near the end of his life, he refused to relinquish control. He issued orders on matters both grand and trivial. He insisted on reviewing plans for a new fortification in the Philippines. He requested inventories of a monastery's kitchen in Aragon. His empire was too large to see, but he imagined it line by line, ledger by ledger. What is remarkable is not the grandeur of Philip's reign, but its paper trail, the surviving records from his rule number in the tens of thousands. They form one of the richest bureaucratic collections of the early modern era. Every shipment, every soldier's pay, every letter from a colonial bishop is preserved. His obsession with documentation created not just a legacy of empire, but a record of how it functioned at the smallest level. But it also left Spain rigid. The delays in decision-making, the bottlenecks of authority, and the constant need for central approval began to slow the machinery. Local administrators became fearful of taking initiative. Military leaders hesitated in the field, unsure whether they had permission to act. Innovation stalled. The very system that Philip had built to preserve control began to choke under its own weight. Still, the king did not change. He believed in the system. He believed that a king could rule the world if he read it carefully enough. And so we are left to ask, can a ruler who never touched half his empire leave behind a deeper influence than those who fought on horseback, simply by teaching the world to write things down and never look away? In the final years of his life, Philip II became a figure of routine. The world outside continued to shift and struggle. Wars dragged on. Trade fluctuated. Disease claimed villages. Storms sank fleets. Yet inside El Escorial, the king persisted. In his habits, he read, he annotated, he signed. The corridors echoed with the quiet rustle of parchment and the soft tapping of clerks transcribing his instructions. It was the rhythm of empire sustained not by force alone, but by habit and record. He rarely left his rooms. The gout had taken much of his mobility. He was often carried in a litter between the chapel and his study. He dictated when he could, not hold a pen. When he could hold it, he signed documents with a hand that trembled more each year. His ministers grew older with him. Many had learned to wait. They submitted reports without expecting immediate answers. Some decisions arrived months after they were needed. Still, the business of government continued. Spain, for all its burdens and debts, remained standing. One of Philip's last projects was a detailed inventory of the crown's possessions. He ordered that every royal building, from castles to hunting lodges, be catalogued. The list included not just rooms and walls, but furniture, tapestries, grain stores, wine barrels, and liturgical vessels. He reviewed drafts of the inventory personally. On one page, he circled an entry describing the silver candlesticks in a chapel and noted that 2 had been missing for over a year. No object, however minor, escaped his interest. He also took an interest in the financial management of religious orders. He sent letters to abbots asking for itemized lists of expenditures. He inquired about the maintenance of altars, the condition of cloisters, and the contents of monastery libraries. He reminded bishops to keep accurate baptismal records. He even wrote to a convent, asking whether their gardening tools had been repaired after a recent frost. It was a way of seeing the kingdom not as a battlefield or a crown, but as a series of interconnected ledgers. Philip believed that what could be measured could be maintained. He distrusted emotion. He distrusted improvisation. He trusted the ink on paper. When the end came in 1598, it came slowly. He suffered fevers and internal pain. He lay for weeks on a bed in El Escorial, surrounded by priests, secretaries, and family members. Even in those final days, papers were brought to him. He continued to read them. His son, the future Philip III, visited often. The old king gave instructions, almost always written. He was not sentimental. He was determined to finish what remained. It is said that one of the last documents he signed was a routine administrative order regarding the garrison at Oran in North Africa. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was a supply request. Yet Philip reviewed it, asked a question about the number of barrels, and approved it with his initials. He died shortly after. There was no dramatic final speech, no grand farewell, just the quiet departure of a man who had lived through maps and memos. When he was buried, it was in El Escorial, the stone palace he had shaped with the same care he had once applied to marginalia. His tomb is marked with his name and titles, but it is the archives that remain his truer monument. Philip's legacy is often debated. Some remember him as the architect of a slow decline, a ruler whose caution became paralysis. Others see him as a builder of administrative strength, a man who created the structures that allowed Spain to function far longer than its military might alone could have sustained. His wars failed more often than they succeeded. His empire, though vast, was never fully controllable, but his records lasted. They remain among the most extensive written collections of royal governance in the early modern world. Through them, we see a king not as a distant figure in armor, but as a silent man hunched over a desk, day after day, asking the same questions. Is this correct? Has it been confirmed? What was done last year? Who was responsible? Perhaps that is what makes his story worth telling. In a time of great conquest and fierce ideology, Philip II ruled by routine. He believed the world could be understood and managed through documents, not perfectly, not always on time, but through constant, careful attention. So as you fall into sleep, imagine a dim room in a stone palace, a tall stack of parchment waits on a desk. A candle flickers. A clerk exhales. And a king, pale and tired, leans forward once more to read. What needs reading? And you might wonder, can the most lasting legacy of an empire be not its territory, but the quiet will of a man who never stopped taking notes? When most people think of Frederick the Great of Prussia, they imagine tall military hats, disciplined infantry, and the rigid tap of boots on cobblestone. He was indeed a soldier king, known for reorganizing the Prussian army and leading it through the 7 Years' War. But beneath the medals and marches was another side, less dramatic, less celebrated, and entirely devoted to agriculture, food regulation, and rural infrastructure. In between his campaigns and court correspondence, Frederick spent an enormous amount of time worrying about potatoes. Prussia in the 18th century was not a wealthy country. It was large in land, but sparse in resources. Much of it was cold, sandy, and agriculturally poor. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, lived in small villages and often teetered on the edge of starvation during long winters. Crop failures were common, so when Frederick ascended to the throne in 1740, he knew that war alone would not secure Prussia's future. He needed to feed his people, and not just with words. He began issuing edicts on crop management, seed storage, and village grain reserves. He read reports from local administrators about weather patterns and soil conditions. He met with botanists. He asked questions about root rot and rainfall. His goal was not merely to grow more food, but to do so reliably. That meant regulation. Frederick was particularly fascinated by the potato, a relatively new arrival to Europe that many still mistrusted. Some peasants believed it caused illness. Others thought it was food fit only for animals. But Frederick saw in the potato a solution to food insecurity. It was hardy. It grew in poor soil. It stored well. It could resist frost. And so, he became its most tireless promoter. He issued orders requiring its cultivation. In 1756, he distributed notices to rural officials, instructing them to plant potatoes in specific districts. He had pamphlets printed, explaining the nutritional value of the crop. He even went so far as to stage a public deception, planting potatoes in royal fields, then having them guarded with soldiers. When curious villagers crept in at night to steal what they believed must be a valuable food, they unknowingly helped spread the crop throughout the countryside. Frederick's interest in agricultural reform did not stop there. He also regulated bread recipes. He believed that bakers should use specific flour blends to ensure sturdier loaves and avoid waste. He issued written instructions on proper oven temperatures. He fined bakers who made their loaves too small or charged too much. City officials were required to measure loaves and record prices. These records were sent to Berlin, where Frederick's clerks reviewed them. One report from Königsberg details an inspector weighing loaves with a balance scale and noting that one baker's rye bread had been light by 3 grams. These were not matters of imperial conquest. They were details of daily life, and Frederick took them seriously. His letters to ministers often combined discussion of troop movements with instructions about canal construction or sheep breeding. He once wrote that a country with a good granary was more secure than one with 10 battalions. Part of this obsession stemmed from his personal philosophy. Frederick considered himself an enlightened absolutist. He believed that a king should serve the people by promoting rational laws, supporting education, and ensuring prosperity. To him, a ruler was not merely a commander, but a manager. He read widely Voltaire, Montesquieu, and the classics. He wrote treatises on governance. He scribbled notes in the margins of agricultural journals. He also toured the countryside. Disguised in plain clothes, he visited villages, inspected barns, and questioned farmers. In one account, he reprimanded a mayor for failing to stock enough winter hay for cattle. In another, he corrected a clerk's ledger, adding up livestock, tallies by hand. He believed that authority meant presence, and presence meant knowing how many pigs were in a district and how much oats they had been fed. His bureaucratic mind extended to disaster planning. During years of drought or flood, he ordered emergency food distributions. He built state-owned warehouses to hold reserves. He had roads repaired to ensure the transport of supplies. Instructions for these actions were written down, reviewed, and filed. Entire volumes of his reign consist not of battlefield strategies, but of grain orders, tax reductions for blighted areas, and directives on how to preserve seed stock during harsh winters. It is tempting to view these efforts as distractions from statecraft, but Frederick saw them as central. He once told a French ambassador that a hungry man has no loyalty. He believed that if peasants were fed and fields were productive, Prussia could survive anything. Not just enemy invasions, but economic downturns and internal rebellion. The state, to him, was not a flag. It was a farm. He also reformed land law. He standardized field boundaries, funded drainage projects, and mapped out regions using detailed surveys. He encouraged immigration to underpopulated rural areas, offering land and tools to settlers who would farm marginal ground. He established model farms, where techniques could be tested and then taught to others. Reports from these farms were sent monthly to Berlin, where the results were compared in ledgers that Frederick sometimes read personally. All of this may sound dry, and in truth, it often was. His ministers sometimes grew weary. Some resented his micromanagement, but they obeyed, because Frederick's orders came with precision and repetition. He did not forget. He remembered which districts had failed to meet planting quotas. He knew which canals had overrun their budgets. He inquired why a shipment of barley had not arrived on time in a particular province. It was said in the court that Frederick had a farmer's memory and a clerk's discipline. So much of his rule, often framed by the drama of war, was instead rooted in the mundane, the size of a harvest, the quality of a wool crop, the condition of a bridge. Yet these were the things he believed would make Prussia strong. And that leaves us with a quiet thought. Can a king best known for winning battles be better remembered for planting potatoes and counting sheep? Frederick's attention to agriculture and rural policy did not fade as he aged. If anything, his focus intensified. With each passing year, he seemed less interested in the pageantry of court life and more preoccupied with rainfall patterns and barley yields. Even during the 7 Years' War, while his troops clashed across Europe and his alliances shifted with alarming speed, Frederick made time to write letters about crop rotation. His correspondence from this period is filled with unusual combinations. A letter to a general might begin with battle plans and end with a reminder to repair a mill. A letter to a finance minister might discuss war debts, followed by a request to inspect an irrigation project outside Breslau. The war brought destruction to much of Prussia's countryside, but Frederick saw to it that recovery began even before the final cannons had cooled. He ordered that burned villages be resettled. He had farm tools manufactured and distributed at state expense. He reduced taxes in war-torn provinces and sent surveyors to assess which fields could still be salvaged. His approach was systematic. He demanded regular reports from local officials, not just on food prices or tax collection, but on birth rates, livestock numbers, and even the number of beehives. These reports, collected monthly or quarterly depending on the district, were compiled in thick ledgers. Frederick reviewed many of them himself. He asked for clarifications. He issued marginal notes with questions. He sometimes corrected figures that seemed too optimistic. His distrust of flattery extended even to farm statistics. The potato remained his favorite obsession. By the 1770s, he had established a sort of agricultural campaign in its honor. He encouraged festivals during planting and harvesting seasons. He had local priests deliver sermons on the moral value of hard work and the utility of potato cultivation. In one decree, he ordered village officials to demonstrate potato planting techniques in public squares. He wrote essays for local pamphlets, describing how the tuber could prevent famine. His tone was not poetic, it was practical. He detailed boiling methods, cooking times, and storage practices. Frederick believed in education as well. He promoted schools, especially in rural areas, not only to teach reading and religion, but to train children in basic agricultural science. He ordered that schools keep small gardens. Students learned to grow carrots, cabbage, and potatoes. Inspectors visited these gardens and recorded their condition. These visits were reported back to Berlin. For Frederick, a school without a garden was incomplete. He also experimented with reforestation. Certain regions had been stripped of timber during the war, so Frederick initiated tree planting programs. He wanted fast-growing pines and oaks planted along roads and near riverbanks. He issued guidelines on spacing and soil preparation. The goal was not only to restore resources, but to prevent erosion and flooding. In one long and particularly detailed letter, he discusses the impact of windbreaks on soil preservation. He cites specific groves that had been effective and encourages their duplication elsewhere. Frederick's reforms extended to the tax system. He believed that peasant farmers should be taxed fairly, but not so heavily that they became dependent on state aid. He ordered a review of the entire taxation structure in 1768. The result was a series of adjustments that considered harvest size, local price fluctuations, and even the distance from market towns. It was not a simple system, but it was deeply considered. He wrote that taxation should be like pruning a tree. Too little, and it becomes wild. Too much, and it dies. Despite his attention to domestic policy, Frederick never abandoned his philosophical ideals. He continued to correspond with thinkers, like Voltaire, even as his own daily work became increasingly focused on manure and frost damage. He saw no contradiction between philosophy and farming. To him, both were parts of the same duty, to serve the public good. He considered statecraft to be a moral enterprise, and that meant not only defending borders, but ensuring that no village went hungry in winter. He also built roads. Dozens of new routes were cut across the countryside, linking isolated farms to towns and markets. These roads were not paved with grandeur. They were packed earth, maintained by conscripted laborers and state-paid overseers. But they allowed trade to grow. They allowed children to reach schools. They allowed grain to move when one region failed and another succeeded. He reviewed the progress of these projects through maps annotated with red pencil lines, sent in by field engineers every season. And still, the king read. The king. Late into the night, he sat beneath candlelight, scanning reports on turnip yields or wool markets. He wore plain clothes, often threadbare. He preferred silence. He ate simply, often bread, cheese, and tea. He had no interest in hunting or opera. He rarely attended celebrations. His ministers learned not to distract him with pleasantries. They brought him tables and lists, and he welcomed them. He believed that the strength of a nation was found not in banners, but in barns. He wrote that prosperity was the best defense. If the people were fed, the country would not fall. So much of his governance came not from inspiration, but from routine. He asked the same questions over and over. How many acres were planted? How much grain had been stored? Were the granaries dry? Had the roads held up after the spring thaw? It was not glamorous, but it was governance. And so we are left with a quiet reflection. Can a kingdom survive not by greatness, but by the dull perseverance of a man who believed that nothing was too small to matter? By the 1780s, Frederick the Great was no longer the energetic young reformer or the daring strategist of the 7 Years' War. His health was in decline. His legs ached with gout. His appetite had faded, and his hearing began to fail. He walked, slowly, wrapped in heavy coats even during warm seasons. Yet the work did not stop. If anything, it grew more constant, more intense. He did not retire from kingship. He grew deeper into it, narrowing his attention more and more onto the thing he understood best, the daily functioning of the state. He spent most of his days at Sans-Souci, a palace that he had designed decades earlier, not for grandeur, but for quiet. There were no extravagant balls or crowded receptions. Instead, there were rows of vegetables in tidy plots, terraces for fruit trees, and long tables covered in reports. His dogs stayed close to him. He often sat with a wool blanket over his legs, reading crop records while one or two of his greyhounds rested at his feet. The world around him had changed. The Enlightenment had spread across Europe. New political ideas were stirring in France. The American colonies had declared independence. But Frederick kept his eyes on Prussia. He believed that ideas without structure were dangerous. A good thought, he often said, meant little if it was not followed by proper implementation. He remained wary of abstraction. He wanted to know how many sacks of rye had been delivered, how many horses had died from illness, how many school teachers were late in submitting their monthly forms. His ministers had grown old too. Many of them had worked with him for decades. Their letters to him had become less formal, more familiar, yet still marked with a respect born of habit. They knew that he expected accuracy. If a district had failed to meet its potato quota, he would want to know why. If a schoolhouse had not completed its garden curriculum, he would write a reminder. and if a granary had been reported as damp, he would order an inspection. His final projects were, unsurprisingly, small in scale, but large in intent. He commissioned a new edition of agricultural guidelines to be distributed to village officials. It included instructions on composting, rotation, livestock care, and food preservation. It was written in clear, direct language, with tables and simple diagrams. He had it printed at state expense and ordered thousands of copies. He also began reviewing old programs, checking to see which ones had worked. In his letters from 1785, he asked whether the canal that had been constructed near the Oder River was still in use. He inquired about a previous forestry regulation and whether the pines planted along the eastern roads had reached maturity. He wanted to know whether certain lands, once thought infertile, had proven useful after drainage. He believed that no project should be forgotten just because it was old. Frederick died in August 1786. He died as he had lived, alone, working. His final day was quiet. He had read reports that morning. He had dictated a few short notes to his secretary. He had asked after a grain shipment delayed by heavy rain. Then he rested in his chair, drifted into sleep, and did not wake again. There was no crowd, no declaration, no final speech. There was just the stillness of a summer night in a plain room. His funeral was modest. At his request, he was buried not with ceremony, but near his dogs in the garden of Sanssouci. It took years for that wish to be honored, but eventually he was laid to rest where he had wanted. His gravestone is simple, just his name, and no titles. What remained, however, was the system he had shaped. Prussia, once a loose collection of territories, had become an organized, functional state. Roads were mapped, schools were standardized, crops were diversified, taxation was more predictable, and at the center of it all had been a king who believed in routine. Historians often remember Frederick for his victories in war, but the stability he left behind came not from the battlefield, but from barns and books. It came from charts of rainfall and tables of crop yields. It came from a government that knew the price of hay in every province and the size of every schoolyard. He had seen kingship not as theatre, but as stewardship. He believed that even the smallest details mattered. He believed that a king should be measured not by what he claimed, but by what he quietly maintained. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let the day fade, picture not a throne room or a battlefield, but a garden with soft soil, a long table covered in ink-stained papers, a cold teacup forgotten near a pile of wheat tallies, and a tired old man making one final note before turning in for the evening. And you may find yourself asking, is greatness sometimes just the quiet endurance of doing small things well, every day, for a very long time? When most people hear the name Charlemagne, they think of crowns, empire, and conquest. They picture a towering figure crowned by the Pope in Rome, ruling over a vast swath of Europe in a blaze of Christian unity. But the true nature of his power and the rhythm of his rule was shaped not just by swords and sermons, but by the daily routines of Aachen, the modest imperial capital he built from stone, marble, and good intentions. It was here, in the geometric calm of the Palatine chapel, that Charlemagne spent much of his later life, and it was here that the empire was administered in wool socks and steady handwriting. Aachen was not a grand city by Roman standards. It was built near hot springs and quiet hills. Charlemagne liked the baths. He believed they had medicinal properties. He built a chapel next to the springs. It was not large, but it was carefully arranged, octagonal in shape, with mathematical symmetry, marble floors, and rounded arches. It reflected a mind obsessed with balance. It was designed by Odo of Metz, who drew from Roman and Byzantine influence. It was not built for show. It was built to last. Inside the chapel, the emperor moved through his days not in parade, but in rhythm. He woke early, often before sunrise. He prayed. He dressed in simple clothing, linen in summer, wool in winter. His socks, stitched by servants in the palace, were thick and soft. Visitors sometimes remarked that he seemed more like a bishop than a soldier. He disliked extravagance. He ate moderately. He drank little. His tastes were plain, even as the walls around him sparkled with imported stone. The administration of the Carolingian Empire was conducted from small wooden desks placed near windows. The scribes worked beside braziers in the colder months. Their job was to copy letters, issue decrees, and maintain the annals. They wrote in Latin, though many spoke the Frankish tongue. Their script was legible and even, Carolingian minuscule, a style that Charlemagne's court helped promote. He believed that clarity in writing was clarity in thought. The royal chapel was not just a place of prayer, it was an office. Messengers came from all corners of the empire, carrying news from Brittany, Lombardy, Saxony, and beyond. They brought parchment rolled in leather, tied with wax seals. They brought grain counts, tax disputes, letters from bishops, and updates on road repairs. Everything passed through Aachen, and Charlemagne, more than many kings before or after, insisted on understanding it. He could read, though he struggled to write. Late in life, he kept wax tablets near his bed and tried to learn to form letters, scratching slowly with a stylus by candlelight. He did not master the skill, but he respected it. He surrounded himself with scholars. Alcuin of York was among his most trusted advisors. The court became a center of learning, with an emphasis on language, scripture, and calculation. Much of this was new. The empire he ruled had been fragmented for centuries. Roads were crumbling, law was local, literacy was rare outside monasteries. Charlemagne wanted to change that, not through conquest, but through paperwork. He issued the capitulary for the missi, a document that outlined the duties of royal envoys. These envoys, called missi dominici, traveled in pairs, one layman, one cleric. They inspected local officials, settled disputes, and reminded people that there was, in fact, a central authority. They brought forms with them. They took notes. They returned to Aachen with reports. Those reports were stored, reviewed, compared. Some still survive. Charlemagne's court also produced the Capitulary of Herstal, the Admonitio Generalis, and many other documents that combined religious reform with civil governance. They instructed schools to be established in monasteries. They required the teaching of psalms, grammar, and singing. They banned priests from conducting services without proper training. They regulated markets, roads, weights, and clerical dress. Charsum, one surviving instruction, a bishop is told to ensure that the church floors are swept weekly and that all chalices be inspected for cracks. In another, royal agents are reminded to count livestock not just for taxation, but to ensure fair distribution. In times of hardship, Charlemagne also issued rules for royal estates. These were not just properties for leisure, they were sources of food, income, and supply. His Capitulare de Villis outlined exactly how these estates should be managed. It named vegetables to be grown. It required the keeping of bees. It listed the tools that should be on hand, including axes, plows, baskets, and linen thread. It detailed how bread should be baked, how wine should be stored, and how horses should be cared for in winter. These instructions were not abstract. They were mailed to estate managers. They were read aloud to workers. They were part of the way the emperor ruled, not from a throne, but from a written checklist. Visitors to Aachen sometimes expected to find a mighty court. Instead, they found a collection of well-fed scribes, rows of parchment, and a king who spent afternoons listening to readings from Augustine or directing improvements to the bathhouse drainage system. Charlemagne believed in hierarchy, but he believed even more in function. He understood that roads mattered more than banners, and that peace depended on full granaries more than grand speeches. He could be ruthless when necessary, especially in war, but he was not a king who thrived on brutality. He wanted structure, and so we see a different image of the emperor, not astride a warhorse, but wrapped in wool, walking quietly through stone corridors, checking a ledger by firelight, asking whether the bread ovens in Metz had been repaired before winter. And this leaves us with a softer question. Was the greatness of Charlemagne found not in the borders he expanded, but in the daily systems he tried to tame, one well-written order at a time? Charlemagne's court at Aachen was unlike anything that had existed in Western Europe for centuries. It was not only the seat of an emperor, but the hub of a broad and slow administrative awakening. While wars and campaigns continued on the frontiers, the center of the empire hummed with a quiet insistence on form. Within the walls of the palace complex, clerks walked across polished stone carrying armfuls of parchment. Choir boys practiced their Latin vowels, while monks copied texts in script so clean it would one day shape modern typography. At the heart of this was the emperor himself. Charlemagne was not a distant ruler. He attended readings. He conducted interviews with abbots and bishops. He summoned scholars to explain grammar and theology. He asked questions about the shape of letters and the rhythm of scripture. He issued laws and then called others to clarify their understanding. He listened. Then he corrected. And then, once satisfied, he issued a written instruction, often in the form of a capitulary, structured like a list. Each section began with a clause. Some were brief, that no man shall refuse hospitality to a bishop. Others stretched into detail, that the granaries of the royal estate shall contain sufficient wheat to provide bread for 3 winters, and that the bread be made according to the custom of the region, without adulteration. The documents were sent to regional lords and churchmen. They were read aloud in assemblies. They were copied and preserved. The palace school, overseen by Alcuin of York, became a place where future administrators learned to read, recite, and write. It was not a university, but it trained the minds that would copy laws, enforce rules, and record taxes. Boys studied classical authors, memorized scripture, and learned mathematics through counting boards and abacuses. Charlemagne visited the school often. He would sometimes quiz the students, asking them to repeat psalms or explain grammar. He believed that law required language. Without clarity in writing, there could be no clarity in rule. He promoted a unified style of script to prevent confusion. This became known as Carolingian minuscule, a rounded, readable hand with distinct spacing between words. It spread throughout monasteries and chancelleries. It made communication easier across the vast distances of the empire. A document written in Gaul could now be read in Lombardy without misinterpretation. It may seem a small achievement, but it was foundational. A new form of governance was being built not with towers, but with letters evenly spaced on parchment. Emperor's attention to detail extended to dress, diet, and scheduling. He rose early. He expected his household to be punctual. He wore a simple tunic and a belt. His cloak was heavy wool. His shoes were soft leather. His meals were modest, mostly boiled meat, bread, and a bit of wine. He disapproved of luxury. His officials were discouraged from wearing ornate clothing or eating too richly at public gatherings. Even his horses were equipped plainly, with serviceable tack rather than decorative fittings. Visitors were often surprised by the informality of the court. There were no long banquets. Instead, there were discussions. Some were theological. Others concerned roads, tithes, and the conduct of priests. Charlemagne wanted to know how the bishopric of Tours was managing its estates. He wanted to be updated on the discipline of monks in Fulda. He asked how many pigs had been slaughtered before Lent and whether the fisheries in the Rhine had returned a full harvest. These details were the texture of his rule. His missi dominici continued their circuits, traveling across rough roads and forested paths. They carried lists of questions. They arrived unannounced. They asked to see documents. They observed the courts. They listened to complaints. Their findings were written down and sent back to Aachen. If an official had abused his power, he could be dismissed. If a priest had neglected his duties, he could be removed. The system was imperfect, but it was consistent. It sent a message that the empire was watching. Even leisure was regulated. Hunting was permitted, but only at specific times and in specific forests. The meat of the hunt was to be distributed fairly among the household. When the emperor traveled, his route was planned with care. Provisions were requested in advance. Each stop included a review of local conditions. He asked about building repairs. He checked on the harvest. He asked whether schools were operating. The Capitulare de Villis, one of the more detailed documents of his reign, provides a glimpse into the depth of this management. It includes instructions for vineyard care, chicken coops, orchard maintenance, and the making of soap. It orders that each estate be prepared for inspection at any time. Tools were to be counted. Cloth was to be measured. All goods were to be inventoried and stored according to type. In one section, it requires that 12 types of herbs be grown in each garden, including sage, mint, and fennel. Another section discusses the breeding of dogs for guarding sheep and the maintenance of the fences around stables. Each item had its place. Each task had its season. Each servant had his role. Charlemagne did not believe in idle authority. He believed in example. His court became not only a political center, but a working model of how the rest of the empire should behave. Discipline, literacy, and order were valued above splendor. A monk who copied texts well was more useful than a nobleman with fine horses. But this devotion to structure did not make him inflexible. He allowed debate. He listened to opposing views. He believed that the church and the law must evolve. He corrected his own errors. He invited commentary. But once a decision was made, he expected it to be followed, recorded, and checked. The empire he ruled was vast and fragile. Roads were often poor. Communication was slow. Seasons could ruin plans. Rebellions could flare. But he held it together not by raw power, but by the weight of regularity. His subjects might not have seen him often, but they heard his words in sermons and saw his policies in grain distribution and tax notices. He was present through process. And so we begin to understand how the empire functioned, not through glory, not through terror, but through a steady accumulation of expectations, maintained by quiet repetition. And we are left to wonder, can an empire survive not because its ruler is feared, but because its instructions are written clearly and followed faithfully? In the final years of his life, Charlemagne's empire stretched farther than any ruler of the West had controlled since the fall of Rome. His authority reached across the Alps, over the Pyrenees, along the Rhine and the Danube. Yet despite that sweep of territory, he stayed in Aachen. He had built it to be his center, not only of government, but of intention. The chapel, the schools, the scribes, the baths, and the long plain corridors. This was the empire in miniature. It was not made of banners. It was made of rooms with desks. By the year 800, when Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Charlemagne was already more administrator than warrior. He accepted the title, but he did not alter his way of life. He returned to Aachen, put the crown away, and returned to his regular work. He did not call himself emperor in the Byzantine fashion. He remained king of the Franks and the Lombards by the grace of God. He saw the title not as a new beginning, but as confirmation of what already existed. He did not change the bureaucracy. He did not add layers to the court. He simply continued what he had been doing. He took a census of lands. He ordered corrections to ecclesiastical boundaries. He regulated the price of wax and the weight of silver coins. He summoned bishops to discuss theology. He wrote letters to abbots asking about the condition of their sheep. He sent architects to inspect crumbling bridges. He reminded governors to keep records of marriages and burials. He reissued the Capitulare de Villis with minor adjustments to address the needs of estates struck by drought. Even his crown was simple. It was not adorned with countless jewels. It was shaped from gold, formed to his head, and worn only when required. He did not stage elaborate ceremonies. He preferred practicality. When foreign rulers sent him exotic gifts, silks, spices, mechanical devices, he accepted them politely, stored them, and returned to the day's list of problems. He kept to a routine. In the morning, prayers and letters. At midday, meetings and readings. In the evening, walks when possible, or quiet conversation with a scholar or advisor. He grew older and slower, but not less active. His days became shorter in winter, longer in summer. He worried about the weather. He asked for reports on late frosts. He continued to push for education in monasteries. He requested updates from distant churches on the state of their schools and the quality of their books. He loved books more as he aged. He collected them, not to display, but to study. His library was filled with commentaries on scripture, copies of Roman law, grammar, manuals, and works of classical authors. He encouraged the copying of ancient texts. He asked for corrections to be made when errors were found. He believed that part of his duty was not just to preserve the state, but to preserve the mind of the past. He issued one of his final reforms in the early 810s. It concerned succession and unity. He wanted his sons to inherit parts of the empire, but to remain loyal to one another. He believed in shared governance, with clear rules. He wrote these terms down. He tried to prevent confusion. He understood how quickly stability could vanish if words were left unsaid or uncertain. When he died in January 814, he was 71 years old. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. His death came quietly. There were no great signs, no omens. The monks of Aachen chanted the psalms. His body was prepared without elaborate show. He was buried in the chapel he had built, beneath a plain stone in the floor. The inscription simply recorded his name and the date of his death. Later generations would surround the spot with ornament, but at the time, it was a quiet farewell. For Busfi, empire did not vanish when he died. His son Louis the Pious inherited it. The structure held for a time. The schools continued. The Missi Dominici kept riding. The churches remained in order. The roads were travelled. The taxes were collected. It did not last forever, but it did not collapse overnight. For a while, the habits that Charlemagne had cultivated of writing, reviewing, repeating, continued to guide the land. Even as wars returned and new rulers fought for pieces of his realm, the influence of his administration lived on in documents. His laws were copied for centuries. His script became the foundation of modern European handwriting. His policies on land, grain, and learning echoed in church orders and royal decrees long after his name became legend. What he had built was not just a Christian empire, but a pattern, not a monument, but a method. He understood that an empire must be more than a memory of conquest. It must be manageable. It must know itself. It must be able to count and plan and remember. And so, as you drift into sleep, imagine a room lit by morning light, a low table, a stack of wax tablets, a quiet man placing a hand on a document, rereading the instructions for a vineyard, considering whether the seed stores need to be inventoried before spring. There is no applause. There is no crowd, just a sense that the world might be made steady by routine. And it leaves us wondering, can the most enduring kind of power be found not in battles or oaths, but in a ruler's calm belief that everything important should be written down and followed carefully? When most emperors encounter defeat, they regroup and retaliate. When Ashoka, ruler of the Mauryan Empire, faced victory in battle, he chose instead to stop fighting. This moment, after the brutal conquest of Kalinga around 260 BCE, has often been described as a spiritual turning point. The war was won, but the carnage unsettled him. It is said that he walked the battlefield in silence, observing the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike, listening not to the cheers of his generals, but to the crying of the survivors. What followed was not a withdrawal from power, but a redirection of it. From that point forward, Ashoka ruled not as a conqueror, but as a guide, and he did it through stone, ink, and structure. The Mauryan Empire under Ashoka was vast, covering nearly all of the Indian subcontinent, reaching into present-day Afghanistan and stretching deep into the south. It was diverse in language, belief, terrain, and climate. Managing such a realm required more than armies. It required communication, so Ashoka began to write. He wrote on pillars, rocks, and cave walls. His words were carved in Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic. He ordered that edicts be placed where people could see them, near roads, markets, rest houses, and river crossings. These were not declarations of war or divine superiority. They were messages about ethics, governance, and compassion. He called them Dhamma, a term that meant moral law, civic duty, and mutual respect. He wanted his subjects to understand how to live with one another, how to respect animals, how to care for parents, and how to speak truthfully. But these messages were not only for inspiration, they were instructions. Ashoka established a system of Dhamma Mahamatras, officials tasked with promoting moral conduct, monitoring public welfare, and reporting on the ethical condition of the people. They traveled from province to province, speaking with monks, merchants, and farmers. They noted how festivals were celebrated, how prisoners were treated, and whether local administrators followed royal policy. They returned to court with observations. Their reports helped the emperor adjust policies, issue new edicts, and respond to grievances. Ashoka also maintained traditional administration. Tax collectors, governors, and military officers remained in place, but he added a moral layer to the state. He expected his officers not only to collect revenue or maintain order, but to serve as examples of restraint and fairness. This meant inspecting courts to ensure justice was given without cruelty. It meant overseeing trade to prevent exploitation. It meant watching how animals were handled in public spaces. He introduced regulations on animal slaughter. Certain species were protected. Butchers were required to limit their kills. Market inspectors had to report on violations. These instructions were not symbolic, they were enforced. Ashoka believed that cruelty in one part of life led to disorder in others. He wrote that a man who abused a cow would likely lie in court, that a merchant who cheated a traveler would eventually sow rebellion. His logic was circular but consistent. Ashoka also addressed the prison system. He ordered that prisoners be treated with dignity, that families be allowed to visit, and that sentences be reviewed regularly. He sent officials to inspect jails and encouraged governors to release prisoners on religious holidays. He believed that mercy was not weakness, but strength in motion. His edicts were remarkably specific. One inscription states that medical herbs were to be planted along roads for the use of travelers. Another orders the digging of wells and the planting of banyan trees for shade. These acts of public welfare were recorded not in passing, but in the same format as military campaigns once had been. Stone pillars that might once have celebrated conquest now bore accounts of water infrastructure. He also encouraged dialogue among religious groups. Though he was a Buddhist, he respected other beliefs. His inscriptions praised the moral teachings of Jainism, Brahmanism, and Ajivika doctrines. He believed that disagreement should not lead to contempt. He urged monks of all paths to speak kindly of each other. He promoted religious tolerance not as an ideal, but as a law. To insult another's faith was considered a civic offense. This moderation extended to the court. Ashoka simplified ceremonies. He reduced the size of royal processions. He lowered taxes on certain artisan groups. He encouraged learning. Though literacy was still limited, he supported scribes and record keepers. He encouraged the training of officials in clarity of speech and fairness of conduct. The records from his reign suggest that governance became not just about control, but about conversation. His palace in Pataliputra was said to be grand, but he rarely indulged in luxury. He often met with monks and teachers. He asked for critiques of his policies. He sent gifts to religious communities not in gold, but in books, tools, and medicine. He wanted his rule to be felt not in splendor, but in relief. The relief of having a road repaired, a debt forgiven, or a riverbank planted with fruit trees. His officials worked from offices made of stone and wood. They recorded land holdings, trade routes, and rainfall patterns. They documented births and deaths, festivals, and famines. They used palm leaves, birch bark, and sometimes copper plates to store these records. These clerks were not anonymous. Ashoka encouraged them to speak with the people. Their task was not only to document the empire, but to hear it breathing. But as with all systems, imperfections remained. Not every governor followed instructions. Not every merchant respected tax law. Some provinces rebelled quietly. Others ignored the edicts entirely. Ashoka responded not with armies, but with repetition. He had the same messages carved again. He revised phrases to make them simpler. He added more examples. He believed that truth needed to be heard again and again. He ruled for nearly 40 years. He watched as temples rose, as cities expanded, and as the teachings of the Buddha spread across the land. He sent envoys abroad, not to conquer, but to share ideas. He recorded these missions. He kept a record of where they went and how they were received. It was governance not by decree, but by record. And so we see him not as a monk king or a warlord turned sage, but as something far more subtle, a ruler who replaced weapons with guidelines, who managed an empire by turning moral thought into practical governance, one engraved line at a time. And we are left to ask, can a ruler change the direction of history not by expanding territory, but by expanding the space where thought and responsibility meet? In the decades following the Kalinga War, Ashoka's transformation from conqueror to caretaker became more than personal. It became institutional. He did not step away from administration. He stepped into it more fully, placing morality at the heart of imperial function. His empire stretched thousands of miles, across mountains, deserts, and river plains, but he believed its true strength came from measured governance, rooted in compassion and maintained by steady hands. He formalized the system of Dhamma Mahamatras, designating them not only as moral overseers, but as mediators. They visited rural communities in distant provinces, listened to disputes, and observed religious conduct. These officials recorded the social mood of the empire. They were expected to report on the relationships between Brahmins and Buddhists, merchants and guilds, villagers and governors. Ashoka read these reports. He revised policies in response to them. When complaints emerged that a local official showed bias or failed to protect minority beliefs, the king responded with orders of correction and, in some cases, replacement. This structure allowed a new kind of loyalty to take root, one based not on lineage or fear, but on fairness. Though communication across the empire was slow, the message was consistent. Ashoka's words, carved into rock, painted onto temple walls, spoken by messengers and repeated in village gatherings, created a framework of expectation. Subjects knew what the emperor valued. He spoke not of dominance, but of conduct. He wrote that all people desired self-control, kindness, truthfulness, and gratitude, and that rulers, more than anyone else, should model these traits. His inscriptions repeatedly warned against arrogance. He reminded his officials that cruelty was easier than discipline, but less effective. He stated that rewards should be given, only when deserved, and punishments only when necessary, and always with regret. This administrative philosophy extended into the environment. Ashoka issued directives for tree planting, not for beauty, but for utility. Banyan and neem trees were planted along roads for shade. Fruit-bearing trees were planted near rest stations to provide sustenance for travelers. He ordered the digging of wells, the construction of shelters, and the maintenance of public gardens. These acts were not left to chance, they were tracked. Mahamatras were tasked with inspecting the upkeep of these features. Stone inscriptions from the period refer to lists of completed wells, including their depth, width, and distance from major routes. In the cities, Ashoka introduced standards for cleanliness and animal care. He banned certain animal sacrifices and regulated the slaughter of others. But he did not impose these bans without explanation. He reasoned that the protection of life, even that of animals, reflected on the values of the whole society. He instructed that oxen and goats used in work be allowed rest days. He mandated that fishing be restricted during breeding seasons. Inspectors were appointed to monitor these practices, and their records were reviewed annually. Ashoka also paid attention to the legal system. He instructed that appeals be allowed. Those who felt they had been wrongly punished could present their case again, sometimes directly through traveling Mahamatras. He ordered that judges be reminded of their duty to act without anger or greed. He described justice as a service, not a right of office. He cautioned against harsh language in the courtroom. Some of these expectations were inscribed publicly, so that citizens would know what they had the right to expect. His belief in access to information was equally remarkable. Though literacy was limited, Ashoka ensured that his edicts were read aloud during festivals and gatherings. Inscriptions were placed not only in capitals, but in remote border towns using regional dialects. Some pillars and rocks bear multiple scripts. Ashoka understood that clarity required not only content, but language. His goal was to reach as many people as possible, even if that meant translating his ideals again and again. He extended this openness to diplomacy. He sent emissaries to Sri Lanka, Egypt, Macedonia, and the Seleucid Empire. These were not conquest missions, but religious and philosophical exchanges. He instructed his envoys to observe the customs of others, to report their laws and beliefs. He sought not conversion, but understanding. In one inscription, he reflects on how all faiths seek the same end: peace and moderation. He advised his subjects to listen to other paths with patience. Ashoka's court, once the seat of military planning, became a center for civil coordination. Meetings were held with scribes, city planners, monastic representatives, and provincial governors. The empire's calendar was reviewed annually, with consideration for agricultural seasons, religious observances, and public works deadlines. The planting of trees had a season. The release of prisoners was timed with full moons and holy days. Grain distribution was adjusted during famines. All of this was recorded in a cycle that was maintained by an increasingly literate network of clerks and stewards. His own daily life reflected this balance. He dressed simply, spoke in measured tones, and restricted royal indulgence. He gave generously to temples and schools, but always asked for accounting. He requested inventories of donated goods. When he sent robes to a monastery, he asked for a report on how many monks received them. When he gifted medicinal plants, he requested updates on their growth. He considered the royal household an example to the realm, and so he demanded of it the same self-control and modesty he asked of the people. Even at the end of his life, he continued to write. New edicts were added in his later years, marked by a gentler tone, a deeper concern for posterity. He acknowledged his earlier mistakes, not with regret alone, but with instruction. He urged future rulers to be more than kings. He urged them to be guides. In one of his final inscriptions, he states that a ruler's greatest gift is to make the people feel heard, and that a state ruled by attention would outlast one ruled by fear. Ashoka died sometime around 232 BCE. His passing was noted but not marked by monumental tombs or parades. His legacy, though, remained etched in stone. The pillars and rocks stood for centuries. Monks preserved his teachings. Villages remembered the wells. Even when the Mauryan Empire declined, the administrative shape he had formed survived in echoes. And so we are left to wonder, can the quiet decision to govern with empathy create a system stronger than any wall, more enduring than any battlefield? Long after Ashoka's death, his name faded from common knowledge. The Mauryan Empire fractured. Successors came and went. New dynasties rose with different ambitions and different gods. The great halls of Pataliputra fell quiet, and the empire's meticulous records vanished into the dust. Yet the stones remained. Across India, in forested hills and river valleys, in market crossroads and remote mountain passes, the edicts of Ashoka stood silently. They were not guarded. Many were half buried or worn by rain. Travelers passed by them without reading, but they were never destroyed. The words carved into them about peace, fairness, and duty had no enemies. They made no demands. They simply stood there, repeating what Ashoka had once believed. Centuries passed. The language of the edicts, carved in the ancient Brahmi script, became unfamiliar. The emperor's name was forgotten. Even the memory of a ruler who had written moral advice on stone faded into obscurity. But the stones endured. They were too heavy to move, too firmly placed to repurpose, and too strange to ignore entirely. In the early 19th century, British colonial scholars and Indian historians began to study these inscriptions seriously. The script was eventually deciphered, the messages were translated, and the name Ashoka emerged once again, not as a vague figure in Buddhist chronicles, but as a ruler whose words had been preserved by stone itself. The rediscovery revealed an emperor who governed not just through control, but through instruction. Each edict had a tone of responsibility, not pride. He had not written to glorify himself, but to guide those he would never meet. He addressed governors, monks, traders, farmers, and children. He explained his intentions. He offered examples. He reminded his subjects that kindness was not a weakness, but a civic strength. Ashoka's concept of Dhamma was not limited to religion. It was a framework for coexistence. He instructed that the elderly be cared for, that servants be treated with dignity, that animals not be needlessly harmed. He described how officials should be appointed based on character, not birth. He warned of greed and selfishness. He asked his readers, many of whom could not read, to trust in the idea that rule by conscience was better than rule by punishment. His legacy spread beyond his borders. Buddhist monks carried his vision east, into Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and eventually to China and Japan. They brought with them not only the teachings of the Buddha, but stories of a king who had turned away from violence, who had governed by example, and who had carved his promises into the earth so they would not be lost. In later centuries, Ashoka became a symbol again, not of conquest, but of principled governance. His lion capital, once perched atop a now weathered pillar, was adopted as the emblem of modern India. His wheel of law, the Ashoka chakra, now spins at the center of the Indian flag. Yet these modern tributes only scratch the surface of what his reign actually achieved. He had built a bureaucracy rooted in reflection. He had placed ethics into official routine. He had replaced intimidation with persuasion. And even after the buildings crumbled and the records were lost, his ideas survived in simple phrases carved where anyone could see them. He did not boast. He explained. He did not order fear. He invited agreement. Ashoka did not leave behind palaces, filled with treasures or monuments etched with his victories. He left behind a system of thought, a bureaucracy held together by tone, clarity, and a deep desire to govern not just the land, but the conscience. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, picture a windswept hill, A stone pillar rises out of the earth, shaped by time, worn by rain. Travelers pass it, unaware that it carries the voice of a king who ruled by listening. The breeze whistles softly through leaves, and the sun touches the edge of carved letters, the same ones he once ordered to be placed for the good of strangers. And you may wonder, can a ruler who turned from war and built a kingdom of words be remembered not because of who he was, but because his silence made the stones speak? Charles V was heir to more titles than most men could pronounce. He was King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and ruler over a growing expanse of land in the Americas. His coats of arms were so complex that they had to be redrawn every few years to include new possessions. Maps of his domain stretched from Peru to the Philippines. People said the sun never set on his empire, but Charles himself never seemed to rest either, not because he was constantly marching across Europe, but because he was endlessly surrounded by paper. From the moment he became king in 1516, Charles found himself drowning in reports. Provinces sent complaints. Governors requested funds. Generals needed instructions. Bishops sought favors. All of it arrived in the form of letters, written in Spanish, French, Latin, German, and Dutch. He understood some languages. Others he learned to read over time. But he understood early on that ruling such a vast empire required more than charisma. It required coordination. Charles established a habit of reading and responding to documents each morning, long before meetings began. He read quickly but carefully, often underlining points of interest or writing notes in the margins. His secretaries followed behind, collecting marked papers and drafting replies. He insisted on reading summaries when time was short, but he preferred full copies. He did not trust condensed versions unless he had already seen the original. Villas, imperial court, moved often. Charles travelled from Brussels to Madrid, from Augsburg to Naples, often carrying hundreds of boxes filled with correspondence. His retinue included not only advisors and guards, but entire administrative units, whose job was to keep track of taxation, grain prices, troop movements, and ecclesiastical appointments. He expected updates from every region, even the smallest. When he stopped to rest, clerks immediately set up tables and unpacked scrolls. His sleep was often interrupted by urgent letters from the front or reports of unrest. He lived with this pressure not for a few years, but for decades. Much of Charles's authority rested not on dramatic speeches or displays of splendor, but on his ability to remain informed. In meetings, he rarely interrupted. He listened. He let others speak, taking mental notes, asking questions only at the end. Those who expected theatrical leadership were often surprised. He preferred muted discussions and slow, firm decisions. His voice was not commanding, but calm. When disagreements arose between factions, be they religious, territorial, or economic, he summoned representatives, reviewed statements, and sought compromise. He kept his own opinions guarded. He was cautious about making promises. He believed that careful delay was often wiser than quick enthusiasm. His strength lay not in inspiring crowds, but in outlasting crises. During the early years of the Protestant Reformation, Charles was pulled in several directions. As Holy Roman Emperor, he was expected to uphold Catholic unity, but as a pragmatic ruler, he knew that religious conflict could tear his empire apart. He responded not with rage, but with process. He convened diets, formal assemblies where princes and church leaders could air grievances. He sat through hours of testimony. He read theological treatises. He issued edicts that were lengthy, detailed, and sometimes deliberately vague. These were not the acts of a revolutionary. They were the acts of a man trying to slow history down. His governance of Spain, though often overshadowed by his imperial duties, followed a similar pattern. He relied on the Consejo de Indias to manage overseas colonies, but he demanded reports on their behavior. He read ship manifests, reviewed missionary accounts, and asked pointed questions about local revolts. He worried about the behavior of conquistadors. He issued laws to limit abuses. Whether they were followed was another matter. but his instructions were firm. He believed that even the farthest provinces should be governed by rules, not rumors. He also maintained a complicated relationship with his finances. The empire was constantly in need of funds. Wars in Italy, rebellions in the Netherlands, and conflicts with the Ottoman Empire drained his treasury. He authorized taxes, requested loans, and approved contracts with bankers from Genoa and Augsburg. Each agreement required documentation. He reviewed the terms personally. In some cases, he revised them line by line. Charles was not a dramatic speaker. He was a slow builder. He believed that lasting decisions came from deliberation. His council meetings were famously long. His letters, though rarely emotional, were precise. He rarely flattered. He rarely condemned. Instead, he explained. He corrected. He waited. At his court, he discouraged extravagance. He dressed modestly. His meals were simple. He took few pleasures aside from hunting and reading. His quarters were filled with books, maps, and scrolls. He rose early, read until mid-morning, met with ministers, ate lightly, and resumed correspondence until dusk. Even during travel, he kept to this pattern. Secretaries accompanied him in carriages, dictating or reading aloud as horses clattered over muddy roads. He ruled in a time of intense pressure. The Protestant Reformation, the rise of the Ottomans, the conquests in the Americas, and the tangled politics of Europe all converged in his reign. But he responded not with grand gestures, but with paper and patience. He believed that the strength of an empire lay in its ability to adapt its forms. He encouraged legal reform. He promoted education. He supported universities and printing presses, not as ornaments of rule, but as tools of understanding. He once said that ruling so many lands was like trying to keep a boat upright in a storm, with the wind shifting direction every hour. And so he adjusted the sails slowly. He held the tiller tightly. He watched the horizon. He rarely smiled, but he stayed upright. And so we are left with an image of Charles, not as a figure of glory, but as a man seated at a table, surrounded by silence, listening to advisors, turning pages, and making notes. The walls are plain. The candle flickers. The letter is sealed. And we ask, can a ruler who conquered half the world be remembered not for what he declared, but for what he read, reviewed, and quietly revised? The deeper one looks into the governance of Charles V, the clearer it becomes that his empire was not sustained by charisma or conquest alone, but by a remarkable capacity for administration. Charles sat at the center of one of the most complex and sprawling bureaucracies Europe had yet known. What held it together was not speed or efficiency, but consistency. Every province, from Naples to the Netherlands, from Castile to Carinthia, was expected to produce documents, censuses, revenue records, shipping logs, conscription lists, and religious reports. And Charles read them. He did not merely glance at summaries. He insisted on detail. His chambers were filled with correspondence tables, ink jars, and reading lamps. When he visited regional capitals, he asked to see ledgers and local ordinances. His curiosity was methodical. He wanted to know not only how taxes were collected, but how the people responded to them. Not only which priest was appointed, but how often he preached. His interest was rarely emotional, but it was genuine. He employed a vast staff of secretaries, translators, clerks, and advisors, each responsible for different corners of his empire. The Council of the Indies managed American affairs. The Council of Castile handled domestic Spanish issues. The Aulic Council advised on German matters, and the Council of State tried to coordinate them all. Each council operated like a miniature government, producing paperwork at a relentless pace. These papers moved through channels of review and signature. Final matters landed at the emperor's table. It is said that Charles's handwriting was slow but neat. He rarely dictated unless absolutely necessary. He believed that writing focused the mind. His annotations on royal decrees were practical. Underline this clause, revise this sentence, clarify this date. He did not write poetry or reflections. He wrote questions. How much? Where? When? Who? His mind though burdened by illness in later years, remained obsessed with tracking the parts of the machine. He trusted few advisors completely. Instead, he cross-checked. If one minister gave advice, he asked for another's view. If a governor sent a flattering report, he requested additional testimony. His caution was not personal. He believed that rulers failed when they believed too much in one voice. He sought patterns across documents, trends in tone, consistency in numbers. His personal life offered little escape. He suffered from gout, a condition that left him in recurring pain and eventually made movement difficult. Yet he refused to slow the pace of his work. On days when he could not walk, he worked from bed. A writing desk was placed at the right height, and secretaries read aloud to him until fatigue set in. He rested only when necessary. He did not complain, but the court noticed the toll it took on his face. His eyes remained sharp, but his hands began to tremble. In moments of crisis, Charles did not raise his voice. He summoned councils. When the Protestant Reformation spread across the Holy Roman Empire, he did not call for immediate war. Instead, he convened the Diet of Worms and later the Diet of Augsburg, trying to preserve unity through policy. He wrote to princes, debated with theologians, and issued edicts aimed at reconciliation. Though he eventually waged war against the Schmalkaldic League, he still tried to maintain legal justifications for his actions. His was a legalistic mind. Even war needed paperwork. The Americas posed different challenges. Reports from governors and missionaries painted a complex picture. New cities, growing revenues, and brutal treatment of indigenous peoples. Charles responded with instructions. He banned the worst abuses of the encomienda system. He sent legal experts to draft the new laws of 1542, which limited forced labor. He ordered that priests be allowed to speak freely, but he also knew that enforcement across an ocean was difficult. His frustration appeared in marginal notes. He asked why his orders were ignored, why cruelty continued, why governors sent one report to Madrid and lived another in Mexico City, though he could not change everything, he kept asking. He believed that attention was a form of rule. If he continued reading, responding, asking, and revising, perhaps the empire would hold. His court remained understated. Grand celebrations were rare. He preferred meetings to ceremonies. Ambassadors noted how little pageantry surrounded him. Foreign visitors expecting a golden throne found instead a quiet man at a desk, listening as pages were turned. The emperor's power, they realized, came not from the volume of his voice, but from the regularity of his focus. He rarely traveled without his archives. Trunks filled with letters, ledgers, and maps followed him. Even during military campaigns, he asked for updated accounts of silver shipments from Peru, grain shortages in Sicily, or unrest in Ghent. His tent was often indistinguishable from an office. Toward the end of his reign, Charles began to think about retirement. The stress of managing so many titles wore on him. He had always considered himself a caretaker of a divine trust, but he also knew that a man could only hold so much. He began planning a careful abdication. It would not be sudden. It would take place over years. He would hand the Eastern Empire, Austria, and the Holy Roman title to his brother Ferdinand. The western half, Spain and the Americas, would go to his son Philip. The documents had to be perfect. Transitions had to be legal, clear, and complete. Even in retirement, he planned to bring some papers with him. He imagined a small estate where he could read, reflect, and keep track of what followed. And so we are left with a portrait of Charles, not as a warrior king or a heroic emperor, but as a paper monarch, whose real strength lay in the slowness of his method, the steadiness of his gaze, and the daily labor of reading his empire line by line. And it leads us to ask, can the greatest kind of rule be the kind that leaves no statue, but thousands of questions written in margins? By the time Charles V arrived at the monastery of Yuste in 1557, his hands were worn from years of writing, his joints stiff from gout, and his voice reduced to a hushed murmur. He had ruled the most expansive empire Europe had ever seen. Now, he had stepped away. There were no drums, no banners. Only the rustling of parchment